Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley, the place where stories linger long after the lights go out. Tonight, we prepared chilling tales paired with the soothing sound of rain to ignite your imagination and make your heart race. If you feel the cold creeping in, tap that like button. It helps keep the shadows alive. Tell us in the comments where you're listening from or share the scariest moment that sent shivers down your spine. Don't forget to subscribe. You wouldn't want to miss what lurks in the darkness ahead. It's late. The building is almost empty now, save for a few cleaners and late-night workers. I stand at the elevator doors, pressing the button, waiting for the familiar chime that tells me it's arrived. The fluorescent lights overhead flicker for a moment before the elevator door slides open. I step inside. It's a normal elevator, nothing special about it. The faint hum of the lights and the soft clink of the metal as the doors close behind me. A few more moments pass, and I press the button for the 6th floor. The elevator jerks slightly, then begins its journey. I'm tired. The day was long, and all I want is to get home. The sound of the elevator moving is comforting, a constant buzz. I lean against the wall and wait. The soft hum continues. But then, something's off. The elevator doesn't slow down at the 6th floor like it usually does. It keeps going. I press the button again, more urgently this time, but nothing changes. The numbers above the door flicker once, twice, and then continue to climb. 7th, 8th, 9th. I can feel my pulse quicken. This isn't normal. The elevator should have stopped by now. Maybe there's a malfunction? But that's not possible. This building is well maintained, the elevators are modern, and I've never had an issue before. The light flickers again, and then silence. The elevator stops. I freeze. The door doesn't open. No chime. No movement. It's as though time itself has stopped. I glance at the display above the door. It's stuck between the 9th and 10th floors, the numbers flashing erratically, as if trying to make sense of something that has no meaning. I press the emergency button. Nothing. No sound. No lights. The air in the elevator feels thick, heavy. It's strange, like the atmosphere has changed, become dense in a way I can't explain. I glance at the door, half expecting it to open onto a familiar hallway. But it doesn't. It's just darkness. I can't see anything through the small gap between the door and the frame. My heart races, and I press the button for the next floor, hoping, praying it'll work. Nothing. I tap my foot impatiently, trying to ignore the rising panic in my chest. I try again, and again, and again, until I realize something even more unsettling. The elevator isn't moving. It's stuck. It's stuck, and I'm stuck with it. I push the emergency button once more, but this time, something else happens. The lights flicker again, but they don't come back on. Instead, the darkness in front of me deepens, thickens. And then I hear it. A soft shuffling sound, like something dragging itself along the floor. It's faint at first, distant. But it's there. In the dark. I swallow, trying to steady my breath. Maybe it's just the building settling? Maybe I'm imagining things. But then the sound comes closer. A scraping, followed by a low, slow thud. I feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The doors are still closed. The elevator is still suspended between floors. I can't see anything, but I can feel it. Something is there. Something is waiting. I press my back harder against the elevator wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. The dark, it feels like it's creeping in, like it's suffocating the air around me. The scraping sound gets closer, and with it, the unmistakable feeling that I'm not alone. I try to control my breathing. I try to think clearly. There has to be a logical explanation. But the scraping is louder now, closer. Too close. My heart is thudding in my chest. And then, without warning, the elevator jerks. I'm thrown slightly off balance as it lurches forward, only to stop just as abruptly. My breath catches in my throat. The doors slide open. But instead of the familiar hallway, I'm staring into a vast, pitch-black void. It's like there's nothing beyond the doors, no walls, no floors, no ceiling. Just infinite darkness. And that's when I hear it again. A whisper. Soft, almost like a breath. And then, just as quickly, it stops. I want to step out, to run, to do anything but stand here. But my legs feel frozen. Something in that darkness is keeping me here. My mind races, struggling to find any logic in the situation, but there's nothing. There's only this overwhelming sense that I'm about to step into something that I can't escape. The lights flicker, and I feel a chill run down my spine. I don't know what's out there, but I know one thing for sure. I don't want to find out. But it's too late. The doors are open, and I have no choice but to step forward. My hand hovers near the door, trembling. I can hear the faint hum of the elevator behind me, but it feels distant now, almost irrelevant. My heartbeat is the loudest sound in my ears, and my breath feels shallow, uneven. The darkness beyond the doors isn't like anything I've ever seen. It's not just the absence of light, it's like the space itself is wrong. It's as if the darkness is alive, a living thing that's waiting for me to step inside, to become part of it. I stand frozen, staring into the abyss. Every instinct in my body is screaming at me to stay in the elevator, to close the doors and pretend like none of this is happening. But the doors, they won't close. They won't budge. They're open, and the darkness beyond them is pulling me in. The scraping sound returns, but now it's not just one. It's multiple, like footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving closer from the darkness. Each step sends a chill down my spine, each one amplifying the fear that's starting to take root deep within me. I force myself to take a step back, away from the door, my eyes darting around the confined space of the elevator. There's nothing but the dim, flickering light above me, and the soft hum of the elevator. But the air is thick. It's oppressive. I can almost taste it, like something unseen is pressing on me from all sides. I turn toward the buttons on the panel, desperate for anything that might break the silence, that might give me an escape. My finger hovers over the button for the ground floor, but I don't press it. Something is telling me no, warning me that it won't work. That nothing will work. A cold draft stirs from the dark void beyond the elevator. It slips in through the small gap where the doors don't quite meet, brushing against my face like a whisper. It carries with it the faint scent of something metallic, something decayed. I step back again, my mind spiraling. What's happening? What is this place? Why won't the elevator move? A soft sound interrupts my frantic thoughts, a creak, low and heavy, as though something is shifting, something just outside the door. I tense, holding my breath, waiting. The sound stops. For a moment, there's nothing. Then, as if to mock my anticipation. The scraping sound grows louder, closer, closer. And then I hear it. A voice. Not a whisper this time. A word. It's barely audible, a breathy rasp, but it's unmistakable. Tom. I freeze. My heart slams against my chest. The darkness beyond the door seems to grow even thicker, swallowing up everything in its path. The air feels suffocating, and I feel an overwhelming urge to run, to escape, but my feet are rooted to the spot. I can't move. For a moment, everything goes silent again, as if waiting for me to do something. I glance back at the elevator panel, but there's nothing. No sign of movement, no change. The elevator is still suspended between floors, the numbers above the door flashing erratically, as though they've lost their meaning. I feel a sense of hopelessness creeping in. This is it. I'm stuck. The voice comes again, louder this time, more insistent. Tom. The hairs on my neck stand on end, and I don't know what compels me to do it, but I do. I take a step forward. I don't know what's waiting for me, but I can't stand the thought of being trapped in here, in this suffocating elevator, with whatever is lurking in the dark. I have to move. I have to get out. But the moment I take that first step, everything changes. The air turns icy cold, and the elevator shudders violently, as though it's being pulled downward. I stumble, barely catching myself as the floor tilts beneath my feet. The scraping sound is louder now, all around me, and I can feel something watching me. Something in the dark. I reach for the doors, my hands shaking, but just as I touch the cold metal, I hear it again. A low, guttural growl. I don't wait another second. I throw myself out of the elevator, my heart racing, my pulse pounding in my ears. I land hard on the ground, but there's no floor beneath me. No walls. No ceiling. Just emptiness. I try to scream, but the sound catches in my throat. I can't breathe. I can't move. And then, before I can even comprehend what's happening, the darkness surges forward, swallowing me whole. I try to fight, to scream, to claw my way out, but there's nothing to hold on to. It's as if I've fallen into the very heart of that darkness, a place where time doesn't exist, where reality warps and twists. And I know, deep down, I'll never make it out. The growl grows louder, the scraping deafening. And then, everything goes silent. My breath catches in my throat as the unseen force tugs at my arm, pulling me back into the suffocating dark. Panic floods my chest, and I struggle against the grip, but it's like fighting against the weight of the world. Every time I try to move, the darkness pushes back harder, as if it's alive, aware of my every thought, every motion. I look toward the figure, desperate, but its eyes remain hidden, and its silhouette stands unwavering, like a sentinel in the night. The voice comes again, calm, insistent, "Don't look away." My entire body shakes, fear taking hold of me, tightening around my chest. I try to scream, but the words are caught in my throat, stifled by the overwhelming force around me. The darkness is closing in, its weight unbearable, and I can feel the chilling cold creeping along my skin, seeping into my bones. But even as it drags me backward, even as the void begins to swallow me whole, I can't look away. The figure, the presence, it holds me captive with its silent command, with the unnatural stillness it exudes. I have no choice but to keep my eyes on it, to hold on to whatever fragment of reality it offers in this endless night. The growl grows louder again, vibrating in my chest, like a beast that's just beyond my reach, hungry and waiting. The ground beneath me shifts, and I feel a sharp, sickening lurch in my stomach. It's as if the void is alive, twisting and writhing, a creature of darkness that feeds off my fear. It pulls at my very essence, dragging me deeper into itself. Suddenly, the figure moves. It doesn't step forward, it simply shifts. One moment, it's there, and the next, it's closer, impossibly close, just a few feet away. But when I blink, it's gone again. It's as though the space between us stretches and warps, never allowing me to truly see it. Don't look away, it repeats, its voice softer now, more insistent. The ground trembles beneath me, a deep, resonating hum that fills the void. And in that moment, I realize with a sickening jolt what's happening. I'm not just in some empty space. I'm inside something. Something enormous. Something that has been waiting for me. For all of us. And now, I am its prisoner. The voice grows even fainter now, almost drowned out by the deep, resonating growl that shakes the very air. My body is trembling uncontrollably. My skin feels like it's being scraped away by invisible claws, and the dark is pressing in from all sides, more suffocating than ever. I hear a shift in the air, a sound I can't place. It's the sound of something moving, something approaching. The growl is louder now, so close that I can feel it in my chest, vibrating through my ribs. Then, the figure speaks again, and this time, there's something different in its voice. I enter something darker. Are you afraid? It asks, the question simple but filled with an unsettling weight. I can't answer. I can't do anything. The void is overwhelming, and all I want is to escape, to break free from this nightmare, but there's nowhere to go. I'm trapped. The voice continues, growing more forceful, its words piercing through my mind. You're already lost, it says, a cold smile hidden in its tone. This place will never let you go. I scream, finally able to force the sound past my clenched throat, but the scream is swallowed almost immediately by the darkness. There is no sound. No echo. Just silence. And then, in that terrible silence, I feel something brush against my leg. I freeze. It's cold. It feels wrong. Like fingers, long and skeletal, grazing my skin. A shiver runs through me, and I look down into the blackness that surrounds me, hoping, praying I won't see what's lurking beneath. But there's nothing. Not at first. Then I see it, a shape, shifting, moving closer, a faint outline in the dark. A figure, more grotesque than human, more distorted than anything I could ever imagine. Its limbs are long, twisted, unnatural. Its body bends at impossible angles, and its face is blank. Just a void, an emptiness where eyes should be, where a mouth should be. I try to back away, but I'm stuck, paralyzed in the grip of the darkness. The figure inches closer, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. It reaches out, not with hands, but with a mass of shifting shadows, long tendrils that wrap around me, tightening, pulling me in. I want to scream again, but the words don't come. Instead, the growl intensifies, now deafening, vibrating through every inch of my body. I feel it in my bones, in my soul, and I realize with horrifying clarity, this thing that is coming for me, is not alone. It is the darkness, and the darkness is alive. The figure moves closer, its tendrils now wrapping around my chest, its cold fingers digging into my skin, as though it's trying to pull me apart, piece by piece. And in that moment, I understand the true horror of this place. The darkness doesn't just consume. It traps. It pulls you in, piece by piece, until there's nothing left of you but fear and despair. And when it's done with you, it moves on to the next person, the next soul, and so on for eternity. I try to fight, try to tear myself free, but there's nothing I can do. The figure smiles now, though I can't see its face. I can feel its satisfaction, its hunger, and I know it's not just me at once. It's everything. The growl echoes in my ears, now joined by 1,000 other voices, all whispering the same thing. Don't look away. And as the tendrils tighten, I finally understand. There is no escape. There never was. The darkness has already won. The darkness continues to press against me, suffocating and endless. Time no longer matters. I no longer know whether I've been here for minutes, hours, or years. Everything blurs into the oppressive blackness that surrounds me. The only thing that exists is the pull, the constant, gnawing pull of the void, dragging me deeper, twisting my very being. I try to focus, to understand what's happening, but the thoughts slip through my fingers like sand. I can't remember why I'm here or how I ended up in this hell. Everything that once mattered, my name, the world, the people I knew, feels distant now, as if it was all part of some dream that's slowly fading from my memory. The growl that fills the air isn't just a sound anymore. It's a presence, a weight that presses against my chest, constricting my lungs, making it impossible to breathe. It reverberates through the endless void, shaking my very soul. I can't see the figure anymore, the one that had stood motionless in the darkness, watching me. It's not gone, though. I know it's still there, waiting, watching. But it's more than just that. It's a part of the void now. It's the hunger, the emptiness. It is this place, and I am its prisoner. There's a subtle shift in the air, a change that I can feel even though I can't see it. It's as if something is moving around me, something not quite alive, not quite dead. Tendrils of darkness coil around me again, pulling, squeezing, until I feel like I'm being torn apart from the inside. The sensation is unbearable, a searing pain that I can't escape. Then, there's a whisper. At first, it's so faint, I almost think it's my imagination, just the wind or the void itself stirring. But it grows louder, clearer, and with it, the pressure intensifies. It's a voice, calling to me. But it's not the voice of the figure. This voice is different. This voice sounds human. It's the sound of someone who's been lost in this place for far too long, someone who's seen the depths of its darkness and has become part of it. Help. The whisper is weak, barely a breath, but it carries an undeniable pain. Please, don't leave, it's coming. I strain to listen, trying to catch every syllable, but the words become lost in the blackness. The growl rumbles in the distance again, closer this time, and with it, the voice fades, as if swallowed by the very air around me. The silence that follows is crushing, thick with the weight of something ancient and hungry. I want to respond, to cry out, but the words won't come. I can feel my throat closing up, my chest tightening. The fear is overwhelming, and I know that if I give in now, if I let myself succumb to the darkness completely, I'll become just another whisper, another lost soul in this endless void. But I can't help it. The void is stronger than I am. I try to move, to force my limbs to respond, but they feel heavy, as if they no longer belong to me. I am losing myself piece by piece, the darkness consuming more than just my body. It's taking my thoughts, my identity, my very will to survive. And then, in the corner of my mind, I hear it again. The voice. This time, it's clearer, more urgent. Run. It's a command, sharp and desperate. It comes from somewhere deep within the void, but I don't know if it's my voice, or if it's someone else's, someone who's been here longer than me, someone who's lived through this nightmare for far too long. Run. I don't know if I have the strength to move anymore. I don't know if I can escape, if I even want to. But something within me, some last spark of resistance, forces my body to respond. I stumble forward, my limbs shaking, my heart pounding in my chest. But it's useless. There's nowhere to run. No direction. The darkness stretches out in every direction, an endless sea that swallows everything. And then, there's a shift in the air. The growl grows louder. I turn, instinctively, and that's when I see it. The figure. It's back, closer than before, its form stretching and distorting in ways that defy understanding. Its presence fills the space around me, and I know, with a sinking feeling in my gut, that I'm too late. The figure steps forward, its shadow stretching out like a hand, reaching for me. The tendrils of darkness wrap around my body again, tighter this time, and the cold, suffocating pressure increases, making it impossible to breathe. Don't look away, the figure whispers, its voice a low rasp, like the sound of nails scraping against stone. I try to look away, but my body betrays me. I can't tear my gaze from the figure, from the blackness that surrounds it. Its eyes, if they can even be called eyes, are empty voids, sucking in all the light, all the hope. It is everything. It is the darkness, the hunger, the end of all things. And as the figure reaches out, its tendrils closing in around me, I realize something. This is it. This is the end. There is no escape. There is no light. There is no way out of this endless void. I close my eyes, surrendering to the pull of the darkness. And in that final moment, I understand the terrible truth. It's never over. The darkness doesn't end. It only waits. It waits for the next soul to fall into its grasp, for the next soul to lose themselves in its never-ending hunger. And I am just one more lost soul, drifting into the eternal abyss. Have you ever walked past something so often that it became a part of your routine, so familiar you barely noticed it anymore? For me, it was the apartment on the 3rd floor. A seemingly abandoned unit tucked away at the far end of the corridor, its chipped wooden doors slightly warped from years of neglect. I used to wonder about it occasionally, but I never lingered. Until the day it vanished. It was a Tuesday morning when I first noticed. I was heading out for work, my bag slung over one shoulder and my mind preoccupied with the mundane tasks ahead. I reached the landing of the 3rd floor, turning instinctively toward the end of the hall. My steps faltered. The door wasn't there. At first, I thought I missed it. Maybe I wasn't paying attention. I retraced my steps, scanning the walls. But all I saw was a smooth, unbroken surface of white paint where the door should have been. No hinges, no frame. No sign that there had ever been an apartment there at all. I stood there, staring, confusion prickling at the edges of my mind. I ran my fingers over the wall, half expecting to feel the faint outline of the door beneath the paint. Nothing. Just cold plaster beneath my touch. That's strange, I muttered to myself, stepping back to get a better look. The hallway felt quieter than usual, the fluorescent lights overhead humming faintly. For a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined the entire thing. Maybe there had never been a door there. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. but I knew that wasn't true. I remembered the door, the peeling paint, the faint smell of dust that lingered whenever I passed by. I had always avoided looking at it for too long, something about it unsettling in a way I couldn't explain. And now it was gone. I shook my head, forcing myself to move. Maybe the landlord had boarded it up, I thought. Renovations, perhaps? It didn't explain the seamless wall, but I convinced myself it was nothing to worry about. I had a train to catch, and standing there like an idiot wouldn't help. But as I walked away, a strange sensation settled in the pit of my stomach, a creeping unease I couldn't shake. Something wasn't right. The thought lingered throughout the day. By the time I returned home that evening, it had grown into a gnawing obsession. I couldn't stop thinking about the missing apartment. The more I tried to rationalize it, the more questions arose. Why hadn't I heard anything about it? Wouldn't there have been construction noise, or at least a notice? I didn't take the elevator this time. I climbed the stairs slowly, my footsteps echoing in the empty stairwell. When I reached the third floor, I hesitated. The hallway stretched out before me, eerily quiet. I held my breath as I approached the far end, half expecting to see the door back in its place, as if nothing had happened. But it wasn't there. The wall looked exactly as it had that morning, smooth, pristine, and unnervingly blank. I stood there for a long moment, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. The air felt heavy, the silence pressing down on me. I glanced around, hoping to find someone, anyone, who might be able to confirm what I was seeing. But the hallway was empty. The doors to the other apartments remained shut, their peepholes dark and lifeless. A sudden wave of dizziness washed over me, and I reached out to steady myself against the wall. That's when I heard it. A faint sound, so quiet I almost missed it. It came from somewhere behind me, a soft rustling like fabric brushing against wood. I spun around, my eyes darting toward the source. Nothing. The hallway remained empty. Hello? My voice echoed slightly, sounding too loud in the stillness. I waited, straining to hear any response, but the sound didn't come again. I backed away, my heart racing. My apartment was only a few doors down. I fumbled for my keys, suddenly desperate to get inside. As I unlocked the door, I glanced back one last time. The blank wall stared back at me, unyielding and silent. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the wall. The blankness of it. The way it seemed to devour the space where the apartment had once been. I kept telling myself it didn't matter. It wasn't my concern. But deep down, I knew I wouldn't be able to let it go. By the time the first rays of dawn seeped through my curtains, I had made up my mind. I needed answers. I spent the next morning searching for clues. I asked my neighbors if they remembered the apartment, but most of them just looked at me blankly. A few gave vague responses, mumbling something about renovations or disinterest in the other floors. No one seemed to care. By afternoon, I was poring over old building plans I'd found in the public records office. My pulse quickened as I scanned the floor layouts, searching for any mention of the mysterious apartment. And then I saw it. The third floor was missing an apartment. Where there should have been a unit at the end of the hall, the plan showed nothing. Just empty space, as if the apartment had never existed. My hands shook as I closed the folder. I sat back in my chair, staring at the documents in disbelief. This wasn't possible. I knew what I'd seen, or rather, what I hadn't seen. Something was wrong with this building. Something I couldn't explain. and I was determined to find out what. The next night, I found myself standing in the hallway again, staring at the blank wall where the apartment door had been. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint hum of the overhead lights. I wasn't sure what I was expecting. Maybe for the door to reappear, or for something, anything, to give me a clue about what was happening. I had spent the day piecing together everything I could find about the building, but the more I searched, the more questions I uncovered. The building plans I found showed no record of the apartment ever existing. There were no photos, no mentions of it in maintenance logs, nothing to prove that it had ever been there. Yet I remembered it clearly. How could that be? I reached out and touched the wall again, running my fingers over the smooth surface. It was cool to the touch, unerringly flawless, like it had been freshly painted. My skin prickled as I leaned in closer, pressing my ear against the plaster. And then I heard it. A faint noise, so soft it was almost imperceptible. It was rhythmic, like the ticking of a clock, but muffled and irregular. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The sound wasn't coming from the hallway, it was coming from behind the wall. I stepped back, my pulse quickening. The noise stopped. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. The sound echoed faintly down the empty corridor. No response. I didn't know what to do. Rationality told me to walk away, to forget about it. But something deeper, something primal, compelled me to stay. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was behind that wall was important. I knocked softly. The sound of my knuckles against the plaster seemed to echo unnaturally, the noise stretching out far longer than it should have. I pressed my ear to the wall again, straining to hear. This time, I heard a whisper. It was faint, like someone speaking from far away, their words distorted and unintelligible. My stomach twisted. I stepped back quickly, my mind racing. Was I imagining it? Was the stress of this mystery playing tricks on me? The hallway felt darker now, the overhead lights dimming slightly as if responding to my unease. The hum of the fluorescents grew louder, grating against my ears. My vision blurred for a moment, and I blinked rapidly, trying to focus. When I looked at the wall again, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A faint outline. It was subtle, barely visible in the dim light, but it was there, a rectangular impression in the plaster, the exact size and shape of a door. My heart pounded as I moved closer, tracing the outline with my fingertips. The plaster felt different here, softer, almost malleable, like it hadn't fully set. Without thinking, I pressed harder, and my fingers sank into the surface slightly. The sensation was wrong, cold and damp, like pushing into wet clay. I pulled my hand back, staring at the faint indentation I'd left behind. The ticking noise started again, louder this time. It was erratic, skipping beats, speeding up and slowing down unpredictably. The whispering followed, faint but insistent, like dozens of voices murmuring just out of reach. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, almost pleading. A sudden chill swept over me, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if the hallway itself were closing in around me. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, the whispering stopped abruptly, replaced by a single, clear word. "Stay." The voice was close, too close, as if someone were standing right behind me. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, but the hallway was empty. The shadows seemed to shift slightly, the light flickering overhead. I turned back to the wall, my breathing ragged. The outline of the door was more pronounced now, the edges darker, as if it were bleeding into reality. The plaster around it began to crack, small fractures spidering outward. I took a step back, unsure of what to do. The whispers returned, louder this time, overlapping and chaotic. The ticking noise grew unbearable, a rapid, staccato beat that seemed to vibrate through my skull. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but it didn't help. And then, as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The hallway fell silent, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly. I lowered my hands slowly, my heart still pounding. The outline of the door was gone. The wall was smooth again, pristine and unbroken, as if nothing had happened. I stood there, frozen, my mind racing. What was I dealing with? Was this some kind of hallucination? Or had I just glimpsed something I wasn't meant to see? Whatever it was, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. The following night, I couldn't resist. My curiosity had turned into an obsession, a gnawing need to understand what was happening. Every logical part of my mind screamed at me to leave it alone, to ignore the strange whispers and ticking noises. But I couldn't. When I reached the third floor, the hallway looked the same as it always did, ordinary, quiet, and lifeless. Yet I could feel something beneath the surface, an invisible tension in the air. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath. I stood in front of the blank wall where the door had once been. My fingers twitched at my sides, and I hesitated for a moment, wondering if I was making a mistake. Then I reached out, pressing my palm against the smooth plaster. The cold seeped into my skin instantly, sharper than before. I pushed harder, and just like the previous night, my fingers sank slightly into the surface. This time, though, I didn't stop. The wall resisted at first, the plaster thick and unyielding, but then it gave way. My hand slipped through as if plunging into icy water. The sensation sent a shiver down my spine. I yanked my hand back instinctively, staring in disbelief at the faint shimmer that rippled across the wall. It wasn't plaster anymore. I couldn't describe what it was, something between liquid and solid, a shifting, translucent barrier that seemed to pulse faintly. It didn't belong here. It didn't belong anywhere. I swallowed hard, steeling myself. If I walked away now, I knew I'd never forgive myself. Whatever was behind that wall, I had to see it. I pushed both hands forward this time. The barrier gave way more easily, rippling like the surface of a pond. I stepped closer, the chill biting at my skin. With one final breath, I leaned forward and passed through. The first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't the kind of silence you experience in an empty room or a quiet night. This was deeper, heavier, as if sound itself had been stripped away. I couldn't even hear my own breathing, though I could feel my chest rising and falling. The second thing was the darkness. It was absolute, swallowing everything around me. I couldn't see my hands, my feet, or even the space I had just come through. It was as if I had stepped into a void, a place that existed outside of reality. Panic surged through me. I spun around, searching for the faint shimmer of the barrier, but it was gone. There was nothing but endless blackness in every direction. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The sound didn't carry. It stopped as soon as it left my lips, absorbed by the oppressive darkness. I took a cautious step forward, my foot landing on a surface that felt solid but gave slightly under my weight, like walking on tightly stretched fabric. Each step sent faint vibrations rippling outward, though I couldn't see where they led. The air felt thick, almost liquid, and every movement was a struggle. It clung to me, slowing me down, pressing against me like an unseen force. Then I heard it. The ticking. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder with every step I took. It was uneven, erratic, skipping beats and changing tempo as if it were alive. My pulse quickened, matching the chaotic rhythm. I stopped walking, my eyes straining against the darkness. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice firmer this time. The ticking stopped. For a moment, there was only silence again. Then, a voice, soft and distorted, as if coming from a great distance. "You shouldn't have come." The words sent a chill through me. I couldn't tell if the voice was male or female, human or something else entirely. It was layered, as if several voices were speaking at once. "Who are you?" I asked, forcing myself to stay calm. "What is this place?" The voice didn't answer. Instead, the darkness around me seemed to shift, the air growing colder. I took a step back, and the ground beneath me shuddered slightly. "You opened the door," the voice said, louder this time. "You broke the seal." "What seal?" I demanded. My heart was pounding now, fear clawing at the edges of my mind. "I don't understand." "You will," the voice whispered. Before I could respond, the ground beneath me gave way. I fell. It wasn't like falling through air or water, it was something else entirely. The darkness around me twisted and swirled, pulling me deeper into its depths. I couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't breathe. My body felt weightless and heavy at the same time, as if I were being stretched in all directions. When I finally stopped, I landed hard on a cold, metallic surface. Pain shot through my limbs, and I groaned, rolling onto my back. The darkness was still there, but it felt different now, thicker, heavier, as if it were pressing down on me. I sat up slowly, my head spinning. In the distance, I saw faint light, a dim, flickering glow that barely illuminated the space around it. I stumbled toward it, my legs shaking with every step. As I got closer, the light grew stronger, revealing the outline of a door. It was the same door I had seen on the third floor of my building, the peeling paint, the warped wood. But it looked older now, more decrepit, as if it had been abandoned for centuries. The whispers started again, louder this time. They came from behind the door, their words blending together in an unintelligible cacophony. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle. Something moved behind the door, a shadow, shifting in the faint light. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But it was too late. The door began to open. The door creaked open slowly, the sound cutting through the oppressive silence like a knife. My heart raced as the whispers surged, growing louder and more frantic. The dim light spilled out into the darkness, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. I hesitated, my hand still hovering near the doorframe. Every part of me wanted to run, to retreat back into the void and hope it would swallow me whole. But something stronger, a desperate need for answers, kept me rooted in place. Beyond the door was a room. At first glance, it looked normal, almost mundane. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper, the pattern distorted by years of neglect. A single, bare bulb hung from the ceiling, its weak light flickering erratically. The floorboards were warped and uneven, creaking softly as I stepped inside. But as I looked closer, I realized something was wrong. The walls weren't quite straight. They curved subtly, bending inward as if the room were collapsing on itself. The air felt heavier here, thick with a metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. And the shadows, those long, twisting shadows, didn't align with the light. They moved on their own, writhing like living things. In the center of the room stood a table. It was an old, wooden thing, its surface scarred with deep gouges and burns. On it lay a stack of papers, yellowed and brittle with age. A single object sat atop the papers, a key. It was small and rusted, the metal corroded in places. Despite its unassuming appearance, it radiated a strange energy, a faint hum that I could feel in my bones. The whispers became clearer as I approached the table. "Take it," they urged. "You must take it." I hesitated, my gaze flickering between the key and the shadows that danced along the walls. Something about this felt like a trap, a test I wasn't meant to pass. "What does it unlock?" I asked aloud, my voice barely more than a whisper. The room didn't answer. I reached out slowly, my fingers trembling as they closed around the key. The moment I touched it, the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, the weight of it pressing down on me like a physical force. I turned the key over in my hand, studying its rough edges and tarnished surface. It didn't look special, but I knew it was important. The papers beneath it caught my attention. They were covered in writing, dozens of pages filled with cramped, hurried script. The words were difficult to read, the ink smudged and faded in places, but I could make out fragments. The door must remain closed. Do not listen to the whispers. The seal is breaking. My stomach churned as I read the last line, scrawled across the bottom of the top page in jagged, uneven letters. You have to stop it. A low, rumbling sound echoed through the room, and I froze. The shadows on the walls stopped moving. For a moment, everything was still. Then, the walls began to shift. It started as a subtle tremor, the curved surfaces rippling like water. The shadows twisted violently, breaking free from the walls and pooling on the floor. They gathered in the corners, writhing and coiling like serpents. The rumbling grew louder, a deep, resonant growl that seemed to come from all around me. The air grew colder, and the faint light from the bulb flickered wildly, plunging the room into near darkness. I clutched the key tightly, my knuckles white. "What is this?" I shouted, my voice echoing unnaturally. The shadows surged forward, converging in the center of the room. They began to take shape, forming a figure, a tall, distorted silhouette with elongated limbs and hollow, glowing eyes. "You shouldn't have taken it," the figure said, its voice a guttural rasp that sent shivers down my spine. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. "What do you want from me?" The figure tilted its head, its glowing eyes narrowing. "You opened the way. Now you must close it." "I don't understand," I cried. The figure extended a hand, its shadowy fingers pointing toward the door I had entered through. It was no longer a door. The frame was gone, replaced by a swirling vortex of darkness that pulsed with a malevolent energy. "The seal must be restored," the figure said, "or everything will be undone." My mind raced, trying to make sense of its words. The papers, the key, the whispers, it all pointed to something larger, something far beyond my understanding. "What happens if I don't?" I asked, my voice barely audible. The figure's eyes burned brighter, and its voice dropped to a chilling whisper. "Everything ends." I stared at the vortex, my grip tightening around the key. My instinct screamed at me to run, to escape this nightmare and never look back. But deep down, I knew there was no escape. Whatever this was, it had already begun. The figure stood motionless, its shadowy form towering over me as the swirling vortex in the doorway pulsed with an otherworldly rhythm. My breathing was shallow, my mind racing. I clutched the rusted key so tightly that the edges bit into my palm, the faint hum of its energy resonating through my body. "What do I do?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. It simply pointed toward the vortex. I turned to face the churning void, its chaotic energy both repelling and pulling me closer. I felt as though it were alive, an endless hunger waiting to devour everything in its path. The thought of stepping into it sent a wave of nausea through me, but I knew I had no choice. I stepped forward, my legs shaky but determined. The vortex seemed to sense my approach, its rhythm quickening. As I neared, I felt its pull intensify, the air growing colder with every step. When I was only a foot away, the whispers began again. They were louder this time, a cacophony of overlapping voices that seemed to emanate from the vortex itself. They pleaded and warned, their words blending into an incomprehensible hum that filled my ears. I held the key out in front of me, unsure of what to do. The whispers surged, their tone shifting to something frantic and desperate. "Don't. You can't. It's already too late." I shut my eyes, trying to drown out the noise. The hum from the key grew stronger, its vibration spreading through my arm. My fingers tingled, and I opened my eyes to see the key glowing faintly, its tarnished surface illuminated by a soft, golden light. The vortex reacted, its swirling mass slowing slightly as the light grew brighter. "This is it," I thought. "This is how I close it." I stepped closer, the pull of the vortex almost unbearable now. My body felt like it was being stretched and compressed all at once, the sensation threatening to overwhelm me. With a final surge of determination, I thrust the key into the heart of the vortex. The moment the key touched the swirling mass, a shockwave rippled through the room. The light from the key flared brilliantly, blinding me. The whispers turned into screams, a deafening roar that shook the very foundation of the space around me. The vortex began to shrink, its edges collapsing inward as the key's light consumed it. I stumbled back, shielding my eyes from the intense glow. "Keep going," the figure's voice commanded, though I could no longer see it. I gritted my teeth, pushing forward despite the force pressing against me. The key was hot now, searing my skin, but I didn't let go. I twisted it, as though turning a lock, and the light intensified one final time. With a deafening crack, the vortex collapsed in on itself, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. I opened my eyes to find myself back in the hallway of my apartment building. The air was still, the familiar hum of the fluorescent lights above a stark contrast to the chaos I had just endured. The wall where the door had once been was now intact, smooth and unbroken. There was no sign of the vortex, the room, or the figure. It was as if none of it had ever existed. The key was gone too. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind struggling to process what had happened. My body ached, and my hands were trembling, but I was alive. As I turned to leave, I noticed something on the floor. A single piece of paper, yellowed and torn, lay at my feet. I picked it up, my heart sinking as I read the words scrawled across it. "The seal is temporary. It will not hold forever." A chill ran down my spine, and I glanced back at the wall. It was still solid, still whole, but the warning on the paper lingered in my mind. I didn't know I had stopped, or what might happen if it came back, but I knew one thing for certain: the door wasn't gone. It was waiting. Have you ever been alone in your apartment at night, lying in the dark, when a sound that doesn't belong catches your attention? That faint, almost imperceptible noise that makes you doubt the stillness of your own home? It started 3 nights ago. I live alone in a small one-bedroom apartment. It's nothing fancy, but it's mine, a safe and quiet haven away from the chaos of the world. Or at least, it was. That night, I had just drifted off when a sound pulled me back to wakefulness. A soft, repetitive shuffling noise. At first, I thought it might be the wind brushing tree branches against the building, but my bedroom faces the courtyard. No trees. I turned on the lamp beside my bed and listened. Nothing. The silence was absolute, the kind that makes you question if you'd heard anything at all. Still, unease crept in. I got up, checked the windows and the locks, and reassured myself there was no one else in the apartment. The next morning, I laughed it off as my imagination. Living alone has a way of playing tricks on your mind, I told myself. But the following night, it came back. Louder this time. The sound was closer now, like something was shifting or dragging behind the wall by my bed. I pressed my ear to the wallpaper, the cold surface sending a shiver down my spine. It was faint but unmistakable, a soft rustling, as though something was moving just out of sight. Maybe mice, I said aloud, trying to convince myself. It wasn't uncommon for older buildings like mine to have pest problems. But deep down, I knew it didn't sound like mice. I slept poorly that night, waking up at every imagined creak or groan of the building. By morning, I was exhausted, but I resolved to put my paranoia to rest. After work, I stopped by the hardware store and bought traps, determined to handle it myself. That evening, I set the traps along the wall where I heard the rustling. The room felt unusually still, as though it were holding its breath. I double-checked the locks on the windows and doors before crawling into bed, determined to sleep through whatever small noises might come. I woke abruptly in the middle of the night, heart pounding. The sound wasn't faint anymore, it was louder, more insistent. A steady, deliberate scratching that seemed to come from within the wall itself. Adrenaline surged through me as I fumbled for the lamp. The room was empty, but the noise continued. I stared at the wall, my pulse racing. The wallpaper looked wrong. The soft floral pattern that had always seemed so harmless now appeared warped, slightly distorted, as though the wall beneath it had shifted. Gathering my courage, I got out of bed and approached the wall. The sound stopped. I froze, holding my breath, waiting for it to return. Minutes passed in silence, and I began to feel foolish. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe stress was playing tricks on me. I reached out to touch the wallpaper, running my fingers over its surface. It felt thinner than I remembered, almost fragile. That's when I noticed it, a faint bulge in the wallpaper, about the size of my hand. It hadn't been there before. My stomach churned, and I took a step back. The rustling resumed, louder than ever, coming from right behind the bulge. This wasn't mice. My chest tightened, and I stumbled back into bed, grabbing my phone. My fingers hovered over the screen, unsure of who to call. The police? Exterminators? What would I even say? That my wall was making noises? I sat there, paralyzed, as the rustling grew louder. It wasn't just a noise anymore, it felt purposeful, deliberate. Like something, or someone, was trying to get through. I didn't sleep that night. Morning brought no comfort. The daylight washed over my apartment, erasing the shadows and dulling the memory of the night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The bulge in the wallpaper was still there, though in the light it seemed smaller, less ominous. Maybe I'd exaggerated it in the dark. I reached out to touch it again, and this time my fingers lingered. The surface was oddly pliable, as though there was empty space behind it. I grabbed a flashlight and a butter knife from the kitchen. If something was inside the wall, I needed to know. My hands trembled as I carefully slid the edge of the knife under the wallpaper, peeling back the corner. What I saw made my stomach turn. The drywall beneath wasn't solid. It was cracked and crumbling, and through the jagged openings, I could see a hollow void. It wasn't just the wall that had deteriorated, there was a gap behind it, too deep and too dark to make sense in the confines of my apartment. I shone the flashlight into the opening. The beam was swallowed by the darkness, revealing only a narrow, endless blackness. But the rustling was back, faint and distant. It was moving. I dropped the flashlight and stumbled backward, my breath shallow. This wasn't normal. This wasn't possible. I needed help. I called the building manager, an older man named Greg who always seemed more interested in avoiding work than addressing complaints. As I waited for him to arrive, I paced the apartment, trying to convince myself that I wasn't losing my mind. When Greg finally showed up, he looked at me with his usual mix of disinterest and annoyance. "What's the problem?" I led him to the bedroom, gesturing toward the wall. "There's something behind the wallpaper. The wall's crumbling, and there's a space back there. I think it might be dangerous." Greg sighed, leaning in to inspect the peeled-back wallpaper. "This building's old. Stuff like this happens. Probably just some settling or water damage. But the noise," I pressed. "There's something moving in there." He gave me a skeptical look but fetched a utility knife from his toolbox. "Fine, let's take a look." Greg cut a larger section of the wallpaper away, exposing more of the damaged drywall. He tapped on it, and the sound echoed, hollow and unnatural. His brow furrowed. "That's weird," he muttered. "Doesn't make sense for there to be a void like this." Before I could respond, the rustling grew louder, startling both of us. Greg swore under his breath, peering into the opening. "Probably raccoons or something. I'll call pest control." "No," I said, my voice shaking. "It's not raccoons. Just listen." As if on cue, the rustling stopped, replaced by a new sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping. It was slow, deliberate, like someone knocking from the other side of the wall. Greg stepped back, his face pale. "What the hell is that?" "I don't know," I whispered. "But it's been getting closer." We stood in silence, staring at the wall. The tapping continued, growing louder and more insistent. Then, without warning, a deep crack split the drywall, running from the floor to the ceiling. Greg jumped back, his toolbox clattering to the ground. "Okay, I'm out. This is above my pay grade." "You're leaving?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. He raised his hands defensively. "I'll call someone. A contractor. This isn't something I can fix." And with that, he was gone, leaving me alone with the wall and whatever was behind it. As the sun set, the room grew colder. The crack in the wall seemed to widen, and the tapping became more erratic, more urgent. I wanted to leave, to grab my keys and run, but a morbid curiosity rooted me in place. I couldn't ignore it, couldn't pretend it wasn't happening. The night stretched on, and the sounds intensified. Scratching, tapping, and now something else, a low, guttural hum that resonated through the apartment. It wasn't just behind the wall anymore. It was inside the room. I sat frozen on the edge of my bed, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. The hum in the air felt alive, vibrating in my chest and pulling at my senses. My breath came shallow, each inhalation sharp and uneven. The crack in the wall yawned wider as though something was forcing its way through. Pieces of drywall flaked off, crumbling to the floor in slow motion. The sound of tapping and scratching grew frenzied, urgent, like claws raking against stone. I had to do something. Waiting felt unbearable, but the thought of leaving made my stomach churn. What if I left and returned to find nothing? No crack, no noise, just an unbroken wall and the gnawing certainty that no one would believe me? The flashlight beam flickered as I directed it toward the crack. It trembled in my grasp, highlighting the jagged edges of the wall. My mind churned, debating, fearing, deciding. And then I heard it. A voice. Soft, distant, but unmistakably human. A faint whisper floated through the crack, too muffled to make out the words, but undeniably real. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking under the weight of my own fear. The whisper stopped. For a long, agonizing moment, there was only silence. Then the voice returned, louder this time. "Help me," it pleaded, faint but desperate. I staggered backward, heart pounding. It was impossible. It didn't make sense. But the voice was there, and it was asking for help. Summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I approached the wall. My fingers brushed the edges of the crack, now wide enough to fit my hand through. The air from within was cool and damp, carrying an earthy, metallic scent. "Who's there?" I asked, leaning closer. The voice didn't answer. Instead, a cold breeze emanated from the gap, chilling my skin. The hum returned, deeper now, resonating like the growl of some great, unseen beast. I shone the flashlight into the crack, trying to pierce the darkness. For a moment, I saw nothing, just an endless void of black. But then, something shifted. A shape emerged, faint and indistinct, like a shadow within the shadow. It moved closer, and as it did, the hum intensified, pressing against my ears. "Help me," the voice repeated, louder, clearer. It wasn't coming from the shape. It was coming from inside my head, reverberating through my thoughts like an echo. I stumbled back, dropping the flashlight. It rolled across the floor, its beam casting wild, spinning shadows across the walls. "No," I whispered, clutching my head. "This isn't real. It can't be real." But the crack in the wall disagreed. It widened further, the drywall crumbling away as though it was being consumed from the inside. Behind it, the shadow grew larger, more defined. It wasn't a person. It wasn't an animal. It was something else entirely. The figure moved closer, and with it came a wave of overwhelming dread. My body froze, paralyzed by a fear so primal it defied logic. The voice whispered again, this time in a language I couldn't understand. The words were sharp and guttural, each syllable scraping against my mind like nails on glass. I turned to run, but the room seemed to warp around me. The walls stretched and twisted, the furniture bending into impossible angles. The air grew heavier, pressing against my chest and making it hard to breathe. The figure emerged fully from the wall, its form flickering like a poorly tuned signal. It was featureless, its surface rippling like liquid shadow. And then, it reached for me. Its limb extended unnaturally, stretching across the room like a tendril of smoke. I scrambled back, tripping over the edge of the bed and landing hard on the floor. "Stay away!" I screamed, my voice barely audible over the deafening hum. The tendril stopped inches from my face, quivering like it was testing the air. Then, as quickly as it had emerged, it recoiled, retreating into the crack. The hum stopped. The room fell silent. I lay there, trembling, staring at the wall. The crack had vanished, the surface smooth and unbroken. But the silence was worse. Because now I knew. It wasn't over. The silence lingered like a heavy fog, wrapping around me and suffocating every attempt to rationalize what had just happened. The wall was intact, its surface smooth as if nothing had ever disturbed it. The flashlight lay on its side, casting its beam across the room in a cold, unwavering line. I stood shakily, every muscle tense, every nerve screaming for me to leave, to run and never come back. But where could I go? The presence wasn't confined to that wall. It had seeped into my home, into my mind. It felt like the very air around me had changed, thicker, darker, alive. I approached the wall, fingers trembling as I touched it. It was cold, unnaturally so, like the surface of a frozen pond. Pressing my ear against it, I listened, bracing for the sound of the voice or the shuffling that had haunted me for days. There was nothing. No hum. No whisper. Just silence. Yet the stillness only heightened my unease. I knew, deep down, that this was no ending. It was a reprieve. I needed answers. The next day, I took a crowbar and a hammer to the wall. It felt insane, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was hiding behind it. My rational mind tried to protest. This was madness, self-destructive paranoia, but the memory of the shadow, the voice, the tendril of darkness, it demanded action. The first blow sent a jarring vibration through my arm. The drywall cracked and crumbled, revealing the wooden studs behind it. I tore into it with desperation, pulling chunks of plaster and insulation away until there was a hole large enough to peer through. My heart raced as I shone a flashlight into the cavity. Dust swirled in the narrow space, and for a moment I saw nothing but darkness. Then my eyes adjusted. There was something inside. It wasn't the wiring or pipes I'd expected to find. It was paper. Old, yellowed paper layered thick against the back of the wall. I reached in, fingers brushing the brittle surface. The texture sent a shiver through me. It was damp and strangely warm, as though it had been recently touched. I pulled one of the sheets free and held it up to the light. It was a photograph. The image was faded, but I could make out the faces of a family, a man, a woman, and a small child. They stood in front of a house that looked eerily familiar, though I couldn't place it. Beneath the photograph was writing, scrawled in a jagged, hurried hand. It read, "They watch us through the walls." I dropped the photo, my pulse thundering in my ears. Digging further, I pulled out more sheets. Each one was similar, pictures of different families, different homes, all accompanied by ominous messages. Don't let them in. The cracks are how they enter. Do not listen to the whispers. A sharp knock echoed through the apartment, freezing me in place. It came from the front door. I stood, heart pounding, my mind racing through the possibilities. It couldn't be a coincidence. Another knock. I approached the door cautiously, peering through the peephole. A man stood on the other side, dressed in a maintenance uniform. His face was pale, almost waxy, and his eyes, there was something off about them. "Sorry to bother you," he said, his voice unnaturally calm. There's been a report of structural damage in the building. I need to take a look inside. I hesitated. Something about his demeanor sent alarms blaring in my head. This isn't a good time, I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a pause. Then he smiled, the expression too wide, too forced. It's important. We wouldn't want anything dangerous to happen. The words hung in the air like a threat. I backed away from the door, heart racing. I'll call the building manager, I said, not at this time. You can come back later. The man didn't respond. I watched through the peephole as he lingered for a moment, his smile fading into something colder. Then he turned and walked away. When I checked the hallway minutes later, it was empty. I returned to the hole in the wall, hands trembling. Digging deeper, I found more photos, more warnings. And then, at the very back of the cavity, my fingers brushed against something solid. It was a small box, wrapped in cloth. I pulled it out carefully, untying the fabric to reveal a plain wooden container. Inside was a single item, a key. Attached to the key was a note, the ink smudged but still legible. The door is closer than you think. I stared at the note, my mind racing. What door? Where did the key lead? The apartment felt smaller now, the walls pressing in as though they were alive. The air grew heavier, the silence deeper. I glanced around the room, and for the first time, I noticed something I'd overlooked, a faint outline on the far wall, barely visible in the dim light. A door frame. It had been there all along, hidden beneath layers of paint and plaster. The key grew warm in my hand. The outline of the hidden door drew me in, its presence undeniable now that I had seen it. I approached cautiously, the key in my trembling hand. The faint seams in the wall seemed to pulse, as if the door was alive, waiting for me to unlock it. What's behind here? I whispered to myself, though no answer came. The air around me grew colder, heavier, with a faint metallic tang that burned my nose. My pulse thundered in my ears as I inserted the key into a lock that wasn't visible but seemed to guide the key into place on its own. With a soft click, the door unlatched. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to turn back, to leave and never return. But something stronger, a morbid curiosity, an unrelenting need for answers, forced my hand to push the door open. It swung inward with an eerie silence, revealing a narrow corridor shrouded in darkness. The flashlight beam struggled to pierce the gloom, its light swallowed by the oppressive black. The walls of the corridor were bare, their surface strange and unnatural, neither wood nor plaster, but something organic, pulsing faintly as though it were alive. I stepped inside. The corridor stretched endlessly, twisting and turning in impossible ways. The sound of my breathing echoed unnaturally, doubling back on itself as though the space were mocking me. The faint shuffling sound that had once haunted me returned, growing louder with each step I took. Then I saw it. A figure stood at the end of the corridor, its shape barely discernible in the dim light. It was tall, unnaturally thin, its limbs elongated and bent at unnatural angles. The head turned slowly toward me, though no features were visible. I froze, my body unwilling to move, my mind screaming to run. The figure began to move, each step producing a wet, shuffling sound. Its movements were jerky, like a marionette manipulated by an inexperienced puppeteer. "Why are you here?" a voice echoed, low and guttural, reverberating through the corridor. It wasn't coming from the figure, it seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. I couldn't speak. My throat was dry, my voice stolen by the oppressive fear. The figure stopped mere feet away from me, its head tilting to one side. Then it raised an impossibly long arm and pointed back the way I had come. "Leave," the voice commanded. I didn't need to be told twice. Turning, I ran back through the corridor, my heart pounding in my chest. The walls seemed to close in, narrowing and twisting, but I didn't stop. The shuffling sound followed me, growing louder and closer with each passing second. I burst through the door and slammed it shut behind me, twisting the key to lock it. The room fell silent. For days, I couldn't bring myself to approach the door again. I taped over the seams, painted over them, trying to erase its presence. But the feeling of being watched never left. At night, the shuffling sounds returned, now coming from all around me. The photos I had pulled from the wall reappeared, scattered across the floor no matter how many times I threw them away. The note attached to the key haunted my thoughts. The door is closer than you think. One night, I woke to find the key sitting on my bedside table, but I had hidden it in a drawer. Beneath it was a new note, written in the same jagged hand. "You cannot lock them out forever." The walls began to feel thinner, the shuffling louder. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, darting away when I turned to look. I knew then that the door was only the beginning. Whatever I had disturbed wasn't confined to the corridor. It was here. And it wasn't going to leave. Have you ever woken up at the same time every night? Not because you set your alarm for it, but because it just happens? That's exactly what happened to me. At first, I thought it was just a mistake. Maybe I had set the alarm wrong. I didn't even remember doing it, but the sound of the phone ringing pulled me from sleep, and when I checked the time, it was always 3:13. Exactly. No matter how many times I changed the settings, no matter what time I tried to set the alarm for, 3:13 would come. It wasn't something I noticed immediately. For the first few nights, I brushed it off, blaming it on exhaustion, a faulty app, or some random glitch. But when the same thing happened again, and then again, I began to get curious. Why was this happening? What was wrong with my phone? Could there be something wrong with the alarm app? I changed my alarm settings, hoping for a fix. I set the alarm for 7 in the morning, then for 5, then for 6:30. But no matter what, I was jolted awake at exactly 3:13. The same time. Every single night. I tried resetting the app, deleting it, and reinstalling it. I checked for software updates. Still, 3:13. The phone had become an unwelcome visitor in the dead of night, dragging me from my dreams into the cold grip of reality. I thought maybe I was just losing my mind. But then, the silence began to creep in. It started with a low hum, a faint vibration I couldn't place. My phone was off, after all, and I hadn't set the alarm again. The buzzing sound seemed to be coming from nowhere. From within the walls, perhaps? It was soft at first, but with each passing night, it grew stronger. I didn't tell anyone about it. I didn't want to seem crazy. What would I say? I keep hearing this sound, this alarm that isn't even set, at 3:13 every night. But one night, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was pitch black, but the light from the clock shone eerily on the wall across from me. 3:13. Again. I felt the pulse of the buzzing growing stronger. The phone was on my nightstand. No notifications. No alarms. Still, the vibrations grew more pronounced, as though the phone itself was resonating, as if it was part of something bigger. I reached out to grab it, but when my hand brushed across the screen, there was no response. It stayed dark. Then I heard something. A whisper. At first, I thought it was a trick of my mind, but the more I listened, the clearer it became. It wasn't coming from the phone, though. It was coming from the air. 313. The whisper sent a chill down my spine. I jumped out of bed and fumbled for the light switch. My heart raced, my breath shallow. When the light flickered on, I scanned the room, expecting to see something. But there was nothing. Just the soft hum of the clock on my nightstand and the usual quiet of the night. The whisper didn't come again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. As if I was part of a moment, frozen in time, waiting for something to happen. Was I just imagining this? Or was this some sort of warning? I didn't know, but I knew one thing for sure. Something was wrong, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't seem to stop it. That time, had control over me now. It's funny how the mind works. At first, you try to explain things away, convince yourself it's nothing, just a coincidence, a strange occurrence, an easily forgotten anomaly. But when it keeps happening, when the patterns begin to repeat themselves with no explanation, your perception of reality starts to shift. The buzzing, the whispering, the unnerving feeling of being watched, it all kept happening. Night after night. 313 would wake me up like clockwork. The air felt heavier, as though something was slowly tightening around me, squeezing the space between the walls, between the minutes, between my thoughts. I tried to act normal. I went to work, met friends, made small talk. But inside, something was changing. There was a gnawing sense of dread that wouldn't go away. The phone, always there, always at my side, its silent, glowing presence, was no longer a tool I controlled. It felt like it was controlling me. I tried leaving my phone across the room. I thought maybe it was the proximity causing the disturbances. But no, 313 came again, louder than ever. My phone wasn't even near me, yet the vibrations seemed to come from the walls. I could hear them now, through the plaster, behind the thick layers of the wallpaper. Soft thumps, like something was moving, like something was scratching at the surface just beyond reach. The hum, the vibrations, they filled the air, leaving an oppressive weight behind them. I didn't dare go near the walls. Something told me it wasn't safe. That it wasn't just the phone malfunctioning. Something else was at play. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to confront it. I needed answers. I grabbed a small hammer from the toolbox and headed straight to the wall where the buzzing had been coming from. My hands trembled and my heart beat in my ears, but I told myself that this was it, the moment I would figure it out, once and for all. I felt absurd doing it. Who else would tear apart their own wall in the middle of the night? Who else would disturb the peace just to chase after an unseen noise? But there was no stopping the impulse. I had to know what was hiding behind the wallpaper. What was causing the hum, the whisper, the overwhelming sensation of something closing on me? I raised the hammer and struck the wall lightly at first, just testing the surface. It cracked easily under the force, and I could hear the sound of the plaster giving way. I didn't stop. The thuds of the hammer grew louder as I struck again and again, digging deeper into the wall. The more I broke it open, the more I felt like I was uncovering something that didn't belong here, something other. And then I stopped. I froze. I heard it. The sound, distinct, clear, came from behind the hole in the wall, and it was unmistakable. Breathing. Slow, deliberate, deep breaths. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the pipes. It wasn't anything I could rationalize. There was something on the other side of the wall. Someone was breathing. I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to acknowledge it. But it was there, close, impossibly close. I couldn't look. I couldn't bring myself to peer through the hole I had just made. I couldn't look at whatever was on the other side. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it all. What was this? What was breathing in the walls? But then, before I could react, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of something moving. It wasn't just the wall, it was the sound of something coming closer. The air itself seemed to shift around me. And then I felt it. A hand. A cold, icy touch on my shoulder. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, expecting to see something standing behind me. But when I turned, there was nothing. Only the oppressive silence, only the echo of my own racing heartbeat. I stood there, unable to move, unsure of whether to run or stay. The room had become suffocating. The phone beside me buzzed. But it wasn't 313. It was something worse. The screen flickered, and for the briefest moment, a message appeared. It's already too late. The phone screen went dark. And in the silence, I could still hear the breathing. The air was thick, heavier now, as though every breath I took was weighed down with something unseen, something pressing in on me. I could still feel the cold touch of that hand on my shoulder, as if it had left a residue on my skin, icy, unrelenting. I wanted to scream, but my throat felt like it was closing, choking me from within. I stumbled backward, my eyes darting around the room, searching for something, anything, that could explain this. The walls, the room, everything felt too familiar and yet alien. The quiet hum was gone, but the weight of it still hung in the air. I knew I couldn't just stand there and pretend it wasn't happening. But where could I go? How could I leave when the entire house felt like it was closing in around me? There was no escaping that presence, that thing. It was in the walls, in the air, in the very silence itself. It was inside me. I reached for the phone again, my hand shaking as I unlocked it, but the screen remained black. No signal. No messages. Just emptiness. The clock on the wall showed the time, 3:13. I felt dizzy. The walls were starting to feel alive, as though they were breathing with me, pulsing in time with my panic. The wallpaper I had been tearing into, the cracks I had made in it, seemed to shift and squirm before my eyes. It was as if the room was mocking me, reminding me that I had only scratched the surface of something far worse. I needed to get out. I knew I couldn't stay there. But as I moved toward the door, I heard it again, the unmistakable sound of breathing, this time coming from somewhere else. A soft rustle. It was all around me now. Everywhere. I turned quickly, but no one was there. Was it in my head? I backed away from the door, my heart hammering in my chest. My mind raced through every possible explanation, but nothing made sense. I thought I saw something flicker in the corner of the room, a shadow, a figure, but when I looked, it was gone. And then there was a whisper. Soft, but unmistakable. It wasn't a voice, not really. More like the air itself was speaking, the walls were speaking to me. Come closer. The words were not audible in the traditional sense. It was like they were felt, crawling under my skin, vibrating in the air, forcing their way into my mind. I pressed my hands to my ears, hoping to block out the sound, but the words were inside me now. The wallpaper, it was moving. I turned toward the hole in the wall, where I had just tried to break through, where I had heard the breathing. But now, there was something else there. A face. It wasn't human. It was the shape of a face, but its features were wrong, twisted and half-formed, as if it were made of the very wallpaper itself. It stared at me with wide, empty eyes, and its mouth stretched into a grotesque smile, its jagged edges peeling and shifting as if the face was fighting to break free from the wall. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The wallpaper was alive, and it wanted me. The figure inside the wall stretched toward me, its arms impossibly long, made of twisted paper and shadow. It reached for me, the fingertips curling, scraping the air as if trying to latch onto my very soul. I was frozen, unable to move, unable to look away. Suddenly, the buzzing returned. Louder this time. It was coming from everywhere, from the wall, from the floor, from the phone in my hand. It was overwhelming. It was too much. It's not over, the voice inside me whispered. It's only just begun. I screamed, but no sound came out. The walls trembled, and the temperature in the room dropped, the breath in the air turning visible in front of me. The figure from the wall was no longer just a face. It was emerging, crawling out from the wallpaper like a nightmare made flesh, stretching itself into the room inch by inch. I tried to run. I had to get away, but the room seemed to stretch endlessly, the door so far away. The wallpaper was closing in, its face now fully formed, leering at me from every direction. The shadows moved, and the floor beneath my feet shifted, the ground itself rejecting me. And then, as I reached the door, it slammed shut before I could even touch the handle. I was trapped. The breathing, the whispering, they were all around me now. It's time. And then, the phone buzzed again. 313. I didn't know what was real anymore. The walls were breathing with me, and I was suffocating in the silence. I was trapped. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the door handle, pulling at it, banging my fists against it, but it wouldn't budge. The walls felt as if they were closing in, pressing in on me from every side. The very air seemed to thicken, suffocating me. I turned around, my back to the door, trying to understand what was happening. The room had shifted, everything was the same, but not. The shadows were longer, more pronounced, as if they were watching me. And the whispering, it never stopped. It swirled around me, sometimes soft, like a distant murmur, other times sharp and clear, breathing directly into my ear. Come closer, the voice beckoned again. But I knew better now. Whatever this thing was, whatever had taken over the space around me, it was not to be trusted. I moved away from the door, my eyes scanning every inch of the room. The wallpaper, it was alive, the way it shifted and moved, patterns twisting and turning as though something was beneath it, something waiting to emerge. A low, creaking sound began, faint at first, but growing louder, as though the entire room was groaning in pain. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, but the next thing I noticed made my blood run cold. The clock. 3:13. I hadn't even heard it tick. How had time passed? Was it still 3:13? Had an hour gone by or just a minute? The numbers blurred, flickered in and out like a dying light. But the whispering in my ears didn't stop. It only grew louder, more insistent. Come closer. I tried to force my mind to focus, to resist the pull. But it was hard. The room was spinning, the edges blurring, as if the very structure of reality was beginning to fragment. My feet moved without my consent, my body betraying me as I stepped toward the wall. The face, the figure, that horrific thing made of wallpaper, it was grinning at me, no longer just a faint outline but fully formed, hanging from the wall like a grotesque mask. The edges of its face trembled, as if it were alive. It was smiling, but not with joy. It was smiling with hunger. I backed away, heart racing, but the room wasn't letting me go. The shadows seemed to follow my every move, creeping closer. And then I realized I wasn't alone. There were more figures. Shadows clinging to the corners, crawling along the floor, skittering just beyond my vision. They were all waiting, watching, stalking. I screamed, but the sound was muffled. I could feel the pressure on my chest as if invisible hands were clutching at me, squeezing. My breath came in short, shallow bursts. I couldn't take it anymore. The walls were alive, the shadows were alive, everything in this room was alive, and it was all closing in. I turned back toward the door, desperate. I had to escape. I had to get out of there. I yanked on the handle again, but this time it moved. It creaked open slowly, agonizingly. My eyes were wide with terror as I stepped forward, ready to bolt out of the room, ready to escape whatever this was. And then it happened. The wall behind me buckled. A sudden, violent movement, like something breaking through, ripping the space apart. My mind couldn't process what I saw next. The wallpaper tore, not with the sound of paper, but like flesh being ripped apart. The figure, that thing, was coming through the wall. Its limbs were long, grotesque, impossibly twisted as it slithered from the cracks, its body folding and unfolding like paper being crumpled. The face was the last thing to emerge, its eyes wide and black, empty, staring straight at me, a twisted grin stretching impossibly across its face. I couldn't move. I was frozen, trapped in its gaze, as it reached for me. My mind screamed at me to run, to fight, but my body wouldn't obey. I felt the coldness of its fingers, no, its claws, graze the back of my neck, sending a jolt of ice through my spine. And then I heard it, that voice, louder than ever, surrounding me like a thick fog. You can't leave. You're already part of it. In that moment, I realized the truth. The walls weren't just alive, they were connected, linked to whatever force controlled this place, this room, this house. They had been waiting for me, drawing me in, pulling me closer until I was nothing more than another part of the wallpaper, another piece of the puzzle. Time didn't matter anymore. It never had. The clock's face cracked, the numbers distorting into a spiral, and the walls began to close in faster, like a living thing digesting its prey. And as the darkness swallowed me, I heard one last whisper. Welcome home. I woke up to silence. A deep, suffocating silence. My eyes shot open, and I found myself lying in my own bed, staring up at the ceiling. It was 3:13. Again. I sat up, my body drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The familiar hum of the room was gone. The whispering, the shadows, the oppressive sense of something lurking just beyond my vision, it was all gone. For a fleeting moment, I thought it was over. Maybe it was all just a nightmare, a twisted hallucination. But the numbers on my phone's screen told me otherwise. 3:13. I reached for my phone, my hands still shaking. I didn't want to look, but I had to. It was as though I was being drawn to it, unable to resist the pull of the clock, that unrelenting, unnatural time. I tapped the screen, and there it was, right where it had always been. The same strange, unnerving time that had haunted me for days, if not longer. My throat went dry. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, convinced I was seeing things, but the numbers stayed the same. 313. It didn't make sense. I had woken up, hadn't I? I had escaped the room, the nightmare, the thing behind the wall. But now I was awake, here, back in my apartment. The familiar surroundings only made the dread creep up my spine even faster. Everything looked normal. But was it? I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up, trying to shake off the confusion. My head was foggy, my mind struggling to piece together the last few moments. Had I ever really left? Had I ever escaped? There was a noise from the other room. Soft, almost imperceptible, but it sent a shock through my body. A faint rustling. It was coming from the hallway. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. For a moment, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe the building settling. But then it came again, a shuffling sound, too deliberate, too close. And then, from the other side of the apartment, I heard it, a knock. Soft at first, then louder, more insistent. Knock. Knock. It was the kind of sound that shouldn't be there, the kind that made every nerve in my body tighten in fear. I didn't want to go to the door. I didn't want to know who, or what, was knocking. But my feet moved. Not on their own, but as though my legs had made a decision for me, as if I had no choice but to follow. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling as I touched it. The air around me felt cold again, the walls seemingly pressing in on me once more, like they were alive, waiting, watching. I opened the door. There was no one there. The hallway outside was empty, just as it should have been. My heart raced, but there was no sound, no movement. Just an oppressive stillness. But then I noticed something. The door across the hall, the one that had always been there, was now slightly ajar. I hadn't remembered it ever being open before. I had lived here for months and had never seen that door unlocked. And then I saw it. A figure, standing just inside the doorway. A dark silhouette. It was still, like a statue, but it was there, unmistakably real. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, its presence heavy in the air. And then, slowly, it stepped forward. I wanted to run. I wanted to slam the door shut and pretend I hadn't seen it. But something compelled me to stay. My feet remained rooted to the floor, even as the figure moved closer. It wasn't a person. It couldn't be. Its movements were too fluid, too unnatural. As it drew nearer, I saw the contours of its face, if you could even call it a face. It was just a blank, pale mask, featureless except for two deep, empty eyes that seemed to stare right through me. A chill ran down my spine. The figure stopped just in front of me, mere inches separating us. I could feel the coldness of its presence, the air around it thick with something ancient, something beyond comprehension. And then it whispered, "You're still here." The voice was a rasp, a low, broken sound that made my skin crawl. It wasn't just a voice, it was a presence, an energy that seemed to penetrate my very soul. The figure reached out, its hand hovering inches from my face. My breath hitched in my throat as the air grew impossibly cold, the space around me warping, bending. "You can never leave." The words hit me like a physical blow, knocking the breath from my lungs. I felt my body trembling, my mind reeling. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But it was. It was as real as the time on my phone. 3:13. It had always been 3:13. And now, I understood. The room, the figure, the unending pull, it wasn't about the clock. It wasn't about time. It was about the end of time. I had never escaped. I had never left. And now, the walls weren't the only thing alive. I was part of it. I screamed, but it was too late. I never believed in fate, or in the kind of things that people talk about when they're trying to explain away the unexplainable. That was before the letter came. Before my reality started to unravel, piece by piece, until nothing made sense anymore. It started with a simple question. One that crossed my mind, unbidden and quiet, like a shadow. What if I was living my life exactly as it had been planned for me? I don't know why I asked myself that question. It wasn't anything I had ever thought about before. But it lingered with me for days, in the back of my mind. It didn't seem important at first. But, oh, how quickly that would change. One morning, I went out to check the mail like I always did. The same routine, grab the letters, glance through the envelopes, throw away the junk. But there was something different in my mailbox that day. A letter. I knew it was mine before I even looked at the handwriting. The careful, distinct loops, the slightly uneven strokes, it was my handwriting. But I hadn't written anything. I hadn't sent myself any letters. My name was on the front. It was sealed, addressed in a way that seemed all too familiar. But no return address. No stamp. Just my name and the address of the apartment where I had lived for years. Curiosity gnawed at me, a sickening unease that I couldn't shake. I opened the envelope carefully, my hand shaking as the paper rustled against my fingers. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded neatly. I unfolded it, my eyes scanning the words written in my own handwriting. In 3 days, you will find yourself standing at the front door of your apartment. You will hesitate. Do not hesitate. Open the door. Do not wait for it to open itself. The words were simple, but the meaning, they gnawed at me. I hadn't written this. I hadn't even thought about my front door. It made no sense. But I couldn't deny it. The handwriting was mine. How was this possible? Why would I have written something like this to myself? I sat there in silence for a long moment, staring at the paper. My pulse raced, and for the first time in a long time, I felt truly unsettled. What did it mean? It wasn't just a prank. There was something deeply unsettling about the fact that it came from me, something I couldn't explain. I put the letter down and tried to push it out of my mind, but it lingered like a shadow in my thoughts. The next day, I tried to go about my business. I ignored the letter, telling myself it was just some weird fluke, a trick of the mind. But then, later that evening, I noticed something strange. The letter wasn't where I had left it. It was on the kitchen counter, open, and, oh God, more words had appeared on the page. You will feel a presence at the window. Do not look. The window will call to you, but you must not look. The moment you do, you will lose control. I couldn't breathe. It was like the letter was following me. It was knowing things before they happened, guiding me, controlling me. The night fell, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something just outside my awareness. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the window, made me jump. I couldn't escape the sense that I wasn't alone. I checked the window, even though I was terrified to do so. Nothing. No one. But I couldn't stop the cold sweat trickling down my back. I closed the curtains and locked the window, still feeling like something was just out of sight, just waiting for me to make a mistake. The next day, I received another letter. Tomorrow, you will meet someone at the corner store. Do not speak to them. They will seem familiar, but they are not. Do not let them come closer. The message was clear. Each word from the letters felt like a warning, like a step along a path I didn't want to walk. But I had no choice. The dread hung heavy, thickening the air around me. And the strangest part? Everything the letters said was coming true. I went to the store the next day. And there, right at the corner, was someone I recognized. A face I knew, but couldn't place. They smiled at me, that smile that made my heart stop, and something inside me screamed. But I remembered the letter. Do not speak to them. Do not let them come closer. I turned away, walked faster. My footsteps echoed in the quiet street. The feeling of being watched didn't leave. Now, as I sit in my apartment writing these words, the third letter sits before me, still unopened. I can hear the sound of footsteps approaching my door, the familiar creak of the floorboards in the hall. I know what the letter will say. I know what will happen next. I feel it coming. It's all happening just as it was written. I can't stop it. I couldn't sleep that night. The events of the past few days kept playing in my mind over and over again, like a reel that wouldn't stop turning. The letters, the things they predicted, everything felt like it was spiraling out of control. And yet, I couldn't look away. I stared at the third letter, now crumpled in my trembling hands, almost afraid to open it. But it was almost like the letter had power over me now. I needed to know what it said. I had to know. My curiosity and fear were at war with each other, and in the end, fear won out. I opened the letter, the paper crinkling between my fingers as I read. Tonight, at precisely 3:13 a.m., you will hear a knock on your door. Do not open it. Do not speak. Stay silent, stay still. The door will not open itself, but you must not touch the handle. If you do, you will lose everything. I dropped the letter in shock, my heart racing as I tried to digest what I had just read. 3:13 a.m. It was always the same time. Why? Why that specific moment? Was it a coincidence? Or was there something deeper, something sinister? The knocking. The silence. What did it mean? And why was this happening to me? I glanced nervously at the clock. It was already getting late, and the familiar dread began creeping up my spine again. I knew I couldn't ignore the letter. It felt like every warning, every instruction, was a thread I couldn't cut. I was trapped. I decided to stay up. The night felt thick with tension, the air heavy, almost suffocating. The house was unusually quiet, the kind of quiet that was unsettling rather than peaceful. My mind raced as I kept glancing at the clock, counting down the minutes to that cursed time. Every minute felt like an hour. It wasn't until the clock struck 3 that the first sound broke the silence. A soft tap. The kind of tap you would expect from a neighbor, maybe knocking to borrow something. I froze. My heart slammed against my chest, too loud, too fast. I stood there, in the dark, staring at the door, paralyzed. I remembered the letter. Do not open it. Do not speak. Stay silent. Stay still. But how could I do that? How could I not look? How could I not see who it was, who was standing just on the other side of that door? The knocking came again. A little louder this time, but still, just a tap. No rush. No urgency. But it didn't feel normal. It didn't feel real. Stay still, I told myself. But the words felt empty. My legs were shaking, my hands sweating. My mind screamed at me to do something, anything, but I stayed frozen. The seconds felt like they stretched into eternity. And then, just as the knock came again, something shifted. The air around me seemed to grow colder, a chill creeping through the cracks in the walls, seeping into my bones. I could feel it, the presence outside my door. It wasn't just a person, it was something else. Something wrong. I glanced at the clock. 3:13 a.m. The time had come. The knocking had stopped, but I could feel it. I could feel something waiting. The silence grew heavier. The air felt dense, like I was breathing underwater. It was then that I heard it. A soft whisper. So faint I wasn't sure if it was real. Let me in. I almost jumped out of my skin. My breath caught in my throat as I stood there, completely still, terrified to move, to breathe. The voice was unmistakable, but it wasn't a voice I recognized. It was wrong. Hollow. It didn't belong. It repeated itself. Let me in. I could feel the cold on the other side of the door, seeping through the cracks, like whatever was on the other side wasn't human. It was something that didn't belong in this world. I shook my head, fighting the urge to open the door. The letter flashed in my mind. If you do, you will lose everything. What did that mean? What would happen if I ignored it? Would the world fall apart? Would I disappear? I had to stay strong. I had to listen to the letter, even if it didn't make sense. The whispers kept coming, each one more insistent than the last. But I couldn't move. I couldn't let myself. And then, there was another sound. This one was different. A loud scratching, like nails dragging across the wood of the door. It was agonizing, a sound that made my teeth ache. I couldn't take it anymore. I felt myself moving, my body acting against my will, inching closer to the door, my hand reaching for the handle. But then, just as I touched it, a surge of cold flooded the room, and I froze. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. It felt as though something was holding me in place. The knocking stopped. The whispering stopped. The air seemed to settle, the cold lifting just enough for me to breathe again. And then, for the first time in what felt like hours, I heard a sound that almost made me lose it completely. A slow, deliberate creak from the other side of the door. It sounded like the door was opening, just a crack. But I hadn't touched the handle. No one had. The door slowly pushed open, and I could see nothing but darkness through the sliver. I closed my eyes and took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath shallow. Something was coming. Something I couldn't stop. Something that was already inside. I backed away from the door, but my legs felt like they were made of lead, as though the weight of the situation had rooted me in place. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. The door, open, even just a crack, felt like the most terrifying thing in the world. The darkness beyond it stretched into an abyss I couldn't comprehend. I told myself to move, to run, to do anything other than stand there and wait for whatever came next. But my feet wouldn't listen. My body was trapped in the haze of fear, my mind screaming at me to act, yet all I could do was stare at the slit of darkness. I wanted to call for help. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. It was as though the very air had been sucked out of the room, leaving me gasping for breath. And then I heard it. A faint shuffle, something almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, inching closer from the darkness beyond the door. I couldn't bring myself to look. A sudden crash made me jump, the sound echoing in the silence of the room. It was followed by the unmistakable scrape of something heavy being dragged across the floor. The noise was agonizing, almost painful, like nails scraping against glass. I felt my skin crawl with the sound, every fiber of my being desperate to escape, to run, to leave it all behind. But still, I couldn't move. I could hear it now, breathing. Heavy, labored, like something struggling to remain steady. The breath was slow and uneven, each exhale vibrating in the air, like it was coming from someplace far away. Or maybe just right next to me. I couldn't tell. I couldn't trust my senses anymore. I glanced once more at the door. The sliver of darkness was still there, but now it seemed wider. The opening was growing, slowly, too slowly, like it was taking its time, savoring the moment. The sound of scraping intensified. Closer. Closer. And then, nothing. Silence. It felt worse than the noise. The silence stretched on for what seemed like an eternity. My eyes darted around the room, looking for anything that would make sense of this madness. I couldn't explain what was happening. I couldn't find a reason for the time, for the knock, for the voice, for the presence behind the door. Suddenly, a shadow moved across the floor, stretching unnaturally long, and I froze, staring at it in disbelief. It wasn't a shadow from the crack in the door. It didn't belong to me. It moved on its own, flickering at the edges of my vision, like it was trying to come closer. A cold gust of wind rushed through the room, as though the window had suddenly opened. But there was no window. There was nothing. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The air was thick with an oppressive force, pressing down on me, suffocating me. And then, the worst part, the whisper returned. You shouldn't have opened it. I spun around, desperately searching for the source of the voice, but I saw nothing. It felt like it was coming from everywhere, filling the room, clawing at my mind. You shouldn't have opened it. It repeated, each time closer, more distinct, and more threatening. And then I saw it. In the corner of the room, standing just outside the sliver of the open door, was a figure. At first, it was hard to distinguish, but as it grew clearer, I realized it wasn't human. It stood impossibly still, its features obscured by darkness, yet its form was unmistakable. Tall, thin, too thin. Its arms hung at odd angles, unnaturally long, and its legs bent in unnatural ways. Its head was tilted to the side, as though examining me. I felt a chill so deep it froze me to the core. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. The figure stepped forward, and I felt the weight of its presence crush the air out of my lungs. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. And then, without warning, it spoke again. Let me in. The voice was the same, but somehow different, more distorted now, like it was coming from a mouth that was never meant to speak. The words echoed in my mind, reverberating in the very air around me. I could feel them press against my skull, pushing through my thoughts, making my head spin. Let me in. I forced myself to move, to take a step back, but my feet felt stuck in place. My pulse hammered in my ears as the figure slowly moved closer. I could see its face now, if you could even call it a face. It was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes. They weren't eyes. There were just dark voids, endless pits of black that seemed to pull me in, to swallow me whole. The figure reached out a hand, its long fingers stretching, inching closer to me, and for the first time, I felt truly afraid, no, terrified. Let me in. I closed my eyes, praying it would go away, hoping this was all a nightmare I would wake from. But the cold, the whispers, the figure, they didn't stop. I could feel the pressure of its presence, the darkness that was swallowing the room, pressing in on me, suffocating me. What should I do? I needed to do something. I needed to escape. But all I could do was stare, paralyzed, as the figure reached closer, its fingers brushing against my skin. And then it was gone. The air cleared. The darkness faded. The room was silent. I opened my eyes, heart still racing, breath shallow. The door was closed. The figure had vanished. But I knew one thing for sure. Whatever had just happened, whatever was happening, wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The letter still sat on the table, staring at me. I knew I had to follow the next instruction, but a part of me wondered if that would even be enough. The time was coming. I could feel it. The next few days were a blur, fragments of moments and unsettling thoughts, but nothing felt real. I woke up each morning, heart pounding, expecting the world to shift again, for something else to happen. Yet, everything remained eerily still. The figure behind the door was gone, the letter lay unopened on the table, its words still echoing in my head. But it wasn't over. I couldn't ignore the letter any longer. Every time I tried, the whispers returned, like a soft hum, just beneath the surface of my thoughts. Let me in. They clung to me, followed me through every hour of every day. I couldn't escape them. The next set of instructions was simple but terrifying. Go to the park at dusk. Stand where the trees meet the path and wait for me. I knew this was wrong. I knew it was a trap, some twisted game meant to unravel me further. But how could I stop? How could I not follow the instructions when they seemed to lead me somewhere deeper, somewhere necessary? What would happen if I didn't? My hands shook as I folded the letter back up, shoving it into my pocket. My mind screamed at me to ignore it, to walk away and never look back. But my feet moved on their own, carrying me toward the door. The sky had already begun to darken as I stepped outside, the fading light casting long shadows across the street. The air was colder than usual, sharp with the hint of an impending storm, but I didn't feel the chill. My nerves burned with an intensity one couldn't shake, and I wondered, for the 1000th time, what would happen if I never stopped following the letter's directions. As I approached the park, the streets grew quieter. There was something unnatural about the silence. The usual noise of traffic and distant chatter was gone, replaced by a deep, uneasy stillness. I could hear the wind rustling through the trees, but even that felt wrong, like it wasn't just the wind, like there was something else moving within it. I reached the edge of the park and paused. The trees loomed ahead, their twisted branches reaching out like gnarled hands, beckoning me in. My heart hammered in my chest as I stepped forward, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. I kept walking. The path stretched before me, shrouded in the dimming light. There was no one else around, no other footsteps, no voices, nothing. The park felt abandoned, desolate, like it hadn't seen another soul in years. The trees stood like silent sentinels, watching me, waiting. And then, I saw it. At the far end of the path, just where the trees met, a figure stood in the shadows. It was hard to make out, but I could feel it, its presence. It wasn't just the figure itself, but something surrounding it, an aura of wrongness that made every hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I couldn't breathe. I took a step closer, and the figure turned, slowly. It didn't move in the way a person should. It was more like a slow, deliberate unfolding, as though it was being pieced together from the shadows. The face, if you could call it a face, was familiar, but twisted, distorted, like looking into a broken mirror. I froze. You came. The voice was soft, like the rustling of leaves, but it was unmistakable. It was the voice from the letter, the same tone, the same words. You shouldn't have come. I felt the cold grip of fear close around my chest, squeezing the air out of me. My legs shook, but I couldn't move. The figure's dark, hollow eyes locked onto mine, and I could feel the weight of its gaze pressing into me, pulling me deeper into the shadows. It's already begun. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, to do anything to escape, but the words paralyzed me. What does it mean? I couldn't understand. I couldn't make sense of it. The figure began to step forward, its limbs bending at unnatural angles, its body stretching like something that wasn't meant to be real. The shadows around it seemed to grow, curling and twisting, wrapping themselves around my feet, pulling me into place. The darkness was suffocating, thick with the sensation that the world was slipping away from me. It's already too late. I felt the ground beneath me shift. The world around me blurred and warped, and I realized, too late, that I wasn't in the park anymore. The trees, the path, the shadows, all of it had vanished. I was standing in a place that wasn't a place at all. I could hear the whispers again, louder now, all around me, filling my ears. Let me in. The figure's smile twisted, jagged and wrong, as it stepped closer. You'll never leave, it whispered, its voice slithering into my mind. We'll always be here. I closed my eyes, trying to shut out the horror, trying to escape whatever this was. But when I opened them again, everything had changed. I was back in my apartment. The room was still. The air was thick, as though nothing had ever happened. But I knew it had. I could feel it in my bones. And the letter? It was sitting on the table again, as though it had never left. The message hadn't changed. It never did. You should have never opened it. Now it's yours to keep. I felt my heart stop. The door behind me creaked. Something was coming. And it wasn't done yet. I didn't dare move. My eyes locked on the letter, but I couldn't focus on it anymore. Something else was wrong, something behind me, in the shadows of the room. I felt it before I saw it. The air was colder now, even colder than before. The silence was so thick it pressed against my eardrums. Then, that soft sound again, the unmistakable creak of the door, slowly opening. I couldn't breathe. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the figure from the park began to emerge, filling the doorway. It didn't step fully into the room, but it didn't need to. Its presence was overwhelming, like a shadow that was alive, breathing. The room grew darker, colder, the very walls seeming to bend under the weight of its gaze. I could hear my heart pounding in my chest, each beat a loud, frantic drum. My legs refused to move. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The figure wasn't real, not in the way things are supposed to be real. It was a reflection, a nightmare made flesh, a twisted manifestation of something I couldn't explain, couldn't escape. I told you, the voice echoed through the room. It was everywhere now, inside my head, curling around my thoughts. You should have never opened the letter. I tried to speak, to scream, to ask what was happening, but no words came. My throat was tight, constricted by fear. I couldn't understand how this was happening. How was it in my apartment? How was it in my life, my world? You've been waiting for me. Its voice was too calm, too certain, like it knew everything about me. Every moment of my life, every choice I'd made, led me to this moment, to this place. And now I'm here to stay. The figure began to move, gliding silently toward me. Each step it took sent a ripple through the air, as if the very space around it was distorting, warping in its wake. It didn't have feet, didn't have legs, it simply floated, or maybe sank through the air. I couldn't tell, but it didn't matter. It was coming for me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. I was trapped. My mind raced, but there was no solution. Every thought was drowned out by the noise in my head, the whispers growing louder, more urgent. Let me in. Let me in. It was the letter. The letter had invited this thing into my life, into my world. And now, I couldn't stop it. I couldn't stop what it wanted. I tried to look away, to avoid the figure's eyes, but they pulled me in deeper and deeper until I was drowning in them. It was everywhere now, inescapable. You wanted answers, it murmured, its voice now so close I could feel it in my bones. You wanted to understand. But the truth isn't something you can escape. The air around me thickened, suffocating. I reached for my phone, for anything, but it wasn't there. It didn't matter. The walls seemed to close in, bending, distorting. The room, the apartment, even the entire world felt like it was crumbling under the weight of this presence. You never should have asked. The figure's form began to dissolve, not in the way things normally do, fading away or evaporating, but in a twisted, painful unraveling. It fragmented into dark tendrils of shadow, each one moving with a life of its own. The room pulsed with them, the walls warping and stretching, and I felt like I was being pulled apart from the inside. You wanted to control time, it whispered. But you can't control what's already been written. The letters on the page flashed in my mind. The instructions. The dates. The places. The events I was supposed to follow. Was this fate? A trap? Or was it all just a sick game? I didn't know anymore. I stumbled backward, my feet catching on something, probably the couch, but it felt unreal, like everything in this apartment was shifting with me. But the thing in the doorway didn't move. It just watched. It waited. The whispers grew louder. Let me in. The air grew thicker still, a weight pressing against my chest. The words, the whispers, were they real? Or were they simply the last remnants of my sanity being pulled away, piece by piece? The figure in the doorway began to smile. It was a grotesque thing, its mouth far too wide, its teeth too sharp. A grin that could never belong to anything human. But it wasn't just a grin. It was a promise. It's already too late, the figure said, its voice now calm, final. You opened the door, and now it will never close. And then, without another word, it was gone. The room was empty again. For a moment, everything felt normal. The apartment was quiet. The walls stood still. The faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. But I knew it wasn't over. The letter lay on the table, still unopened. I picked it up again, trembling. But this time, there was no mystery left in the words. No more fear. The truth was simple, clear. You'll never escape. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 3:13 in the morning. Again. And I knew, with a sinking certainty in my chest, that this was the time that would never change. This was the time I would always return to. The moment where it all started. Where it would never end. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt like someone was watching you, not from a distance, but up close, almost too close to be comfortable? What if that someone wasn't a stranger at all, but someone who knew you better than you knew yourself? The invitation came a week before the event, a costume party at a friend's house. The theme was twins, a fun little idea where you were supposed to show up in pairs, whether as matching costumes or identical outfits. I'd always been excited by the idea of wearing something elaborate, something creative. So, when I received the invitation, I immediately started thinking about what I could wear. After some deliberation, I settled on a classic, a simple yet bold choice, a Venetian mask, paired with a long, dark coat that made me feel like I had stepped out of some long-forgotten mystery. The night of the party, the atmosphere buzzed with excitement as people arrived, clad in various outlandish outfits. Laughter and music filled the air. But despite the revelry, there was a subtle undercurrent of unease that tugged at me. It wasn't anything obvious, but a feeling that had me glancing over my shoulder once or twice. I pushed the feeling aside and went to grab a drink, trying to relax. The moment I walked into the living room, however, something stopped me cold. Standing across the room was someone wearing the exact same mask as I was. Same dark coat. Same expressionless face behind the mask, staring directly at me. I froze. I couldn't look away. The stranger didn't move, didn't react. They simply stood there, almost too still. It felt as if the rest of the room faded away, and all that existed was me and this person. After what seemed like an eternity, the stranger tilted their head, just slightly, as though they recognized something in me. And then, without a word, they turned and disappeared into the crowd. My heart pounded in my chest. I knew it was possible for someone to have the same costume, but the exact same details? The same mask? It felt wrong. There was something unsettling about it, something more than coincidence. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered. All night, I kept an eye on the crowd, half expecting to see the stranger again. But they never returned. By the time the party was winding down, I had almost convinced myself it was just a coincidence. After all, there were plenty of people at the party, and it was a costume event, nothing too strange about a matching outfit. When I returned home, I dropped my bag by the door and headed to the kitchen to grab some water. I tried to push the unease from the night out of my mind. But as I turned the corner into my living room, I froze. There, on the couch, was the mask. The exact same one I had worn. It was placed carefully, as if someone had set it there intentionally. I didn't understand. How could it be here? I hadn't taken it off all night. I searched through my bag, but it wasn't there. No sign of the mask. My stomach churned. The whole thing didn't make sense. My thoughts raced as I stood there in the doorway, staring at the mask on the couch. I had to be imagining things, right? There was no way this could be real. I went closer, picking it up gingerly, as though it might bite. The mask felt colder than I remembered. And it was heavier, like something had changed in the time it had been away from me. My hands trembled as I turned it over in my palms. On the inside, there was a faint, nearly invisible imprint, as if someone had worn it just before I had. I looked around the room, my pulse quickening. Was someone hiding here? Watching me? My own reflection in the mirror across the room seemed to shift slightly, as if it wasn't quite mine anymore. I couldn't stand it. I had to know more. I had to understand what was happening, even if it meant confronting whatever was lurking in the shadows. As I sat on the couch, clutching the mask tightly, the air in the room felt heavier. I looked back at the doorway. Every creak of the floorboards seemed louder, more deliberate. A chill ran down my spine. Something was wrong. Someone was in my home. Suddenly, the lights flickered. Just for a moment, but long enough to make me stop breathing. And then I heard it, soft footsteps, slow and measured, coming from the hall. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest as I sat motionless, clutching the mask in my lap. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the footsteps stopped. Everything fell silent. I didn't know what to do. Should I call the police? Run? I couldn't even think straight anymore. My mind was spinning, too many questions swirling in my head. Who was the person at the party? Why did they leave? Why was their mask in my house? I forced myself to stand, to move, but every step felt like it took more energy than it should have. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, as if the walls were closing in. I turned toward the hallway, but something caught my eye. On the wall, in the reflection of the mirror, I saw it. The shadow of a figure standing just behind me, wearing the same mask. The same cold eyes staring back at me. My stomach dropped. I wasn't alone. I didn't know what to do. My body was frozen in place, my legs refusing to move. The shadow in the mirror seemed to shift with my every breath, as though it was somehow tethered to me, reflecting my every movement. I turned slowly, heart pounding in my chest, but when I glanced over my shoulder, there was nothing. No figure, no one standing behind me, nothing but the empty hallway and the faint glow of the light above. Was I imagining it? My mind raced, but there was no denying the feeling, the cold, suffocating weight of being watched. I could feel it, deep in my bones. The mask still clutched in my hands felt heavy, as if something sinister was now attached to it. I couldn't stay here. I had to get out. But before I could move, I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and coming from the hallway. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to know. But my body betrayed me, turning towards the sound. My breath caught in my throat when I saw it. A faint shadow, shifting just out of sight at the corner of the hall. My heart raced, my pulse thumping in my ears. I backed away, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, but I was paralyzed with fear. The footsteps stopped. Then, a voice. Did you think you could hide from me? The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but there was a familiarity to it. A chilling recognition. It was my own voice. I spun around, my eyes darting in panic, but there was still no one there. Just the empty hallway, the dark corners that seemed to swallow the light. I was alone. I had to be. Yet, the voice had come from inside me. Inside my head. A sudden realization hit me. The mask. It wasn't just a costume. It wasn't just a prop for a party. It had become something else, something much more sinister. A symbol of this, whatever it was. This presence that was following me. I looked at the mask again, my hands trembling as I held it up. The cold, featureless face stared back at me, but now it seemed to mock me. It was as though the mask knew something I didn't, knew something I couldn't yet comprehend. I felt its weight grow heavier in my hands, pulling me deeper into a sense of dread. I had to get rid of it. Destroy it, throw it away, anything to break the connection. I marched to the trash can, ready to toss it in and be done with it, but when I reached out to drop it, the air in the room shifted. The temperature dropped suddenly, a chill sweeping through the space. A cold, dark presence filled the room. I froze. I couldn't let go. My fingers curled tighter around the mask. It was as if it had become part of me, like I was being pulled toward it, unable to escape. Panic surged through me. The mask, the figure at the party, the footsteps in the hall, they were all connected. And then, I heard the voice again. You can't escape me. This time, it was clear. It was no longer a whisper, but a full, unmistakable sentence. The voice was coming from all around me, echoing in my mind, as though it was inside my very thoughts. My heart raced, and I felt a strange pull toward the mask. I couldn't think straight anymore. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my body didn't obey. Slowly, I found myself walking back toward the mirror, drawn to it. The reflection in the glass was wrong. The mask was now on my face. I had never put it on. Not after the party. But there it was, covering my face, its empty eyes staring back at me. No. This couldn't be real. I jerked back, hands shaking as I ripped the mask off, but when I looked at it, it wasn't the same mask anymore. The features were distorted, the eyes hollow and dark, the mouth twisted in a grotesque grin. It was no longer the mask I had worn, no longer something I recognized. I dropped it to the floor, backing away quickly, my breathing erratic. It had changed. The presence, the shadow, it was growing stronger. I couldn't escape it. It was here. It was in my house. It was in my mind. In a blind panic, I ran to the door, my hand gripping the knob. But when I turned it, I felt resistance. The door wouldn't open. It was locked from the other side. A deep, hollow laugh echoed from within the room, and I spun around. The mask, now lying motionless on the floor, seemed to smile at me. A knowing smile. Suddenly, I heard the footsteps again. Closer now. Too close. I had to get out. But I wasn't sure where to go. How could I escape from something that seemed to be inside of me, stalking me, wearing my face? Then I heard it again, clearer this time, right behind me, whispering in my ear. Let me in. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Nothing but the empty air and the faint echo of the voice. I could feel it now, though. The presence, the thing that had been following me all along. It was here. And it wasn't leaving until it had what it wanted. What it wanted was me. I staggered backward, my mind racing as I tried to make sense of what was happening. The cold grip of fear tightened around my chest, and I gasped for air. My heart was beating too fast, my hands trembling uncontrollably. The door was still locked. I twisted the knob again, pulling with all my strength, but it was as if something on the other side was holding it shut. I couldn't break free. I couldn't escape. The footsteps were getting closer, now muffled, as though the figure was approaching with careful precision. I could hear them, steady and rhythmic, echoing through the empty room. My thoughts raced, but I couldn't find any way to fight it, to make sense of the impossible. I backed away, stumbling over furniture, my mind hazy with fear. The mask on the floor seemed to watch me, its grotesque smile still painted on its face. But I couldn't look at it. I couldn't think about it. All I could think about was the footsteps, the voice, the chilling realization that something was very wrong. I glanced at the window. The curtains were drawn, and the darkened street outside offered no help. No escape. No safety. There was nothing. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in, as if they were pressing against me, suffocating me. Then, I heard it again. "Let me in." The voice was no longer a whisper. It was louder now, resonating in the very core of my being. It was a demand, a plea, a dark promise that made my stomach churn. I spun around, searching frantically for the source, but there was nothing there. And then, I saw it. In the reflection of the mirror, just behind me, a figure stood. But it wasn't just any figure. It was me. Or at least, it looked like me. The same clothes. The same mask. But the eyes, those eyes weren't mine. They were darker, empty, hollowed out like sockets of darkness. They stared at me, emotionless, detached from the world around them. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I had seen this figure before. The one who had been at the party, the one who had been wearing the same mask, staring at me from across the room. The one who had disappeared. It had been waiting for me. I reached out toward the mirror, my fingers brushing against the cold glass. The figure in the reflection mirrored my movement, but then it stepped closer. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was real. I pulled my hand back quickly, my body jolting in panic. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled away from the mirror, feeling the ground beneath me spin. I needed to think. I needed to do something. But I was running out of time. Suddenly, the figure in the mirror moved again, its eyes locking onto mine, its twisted smile stretching wider. The air grew colder, and I could feel the chill crawling up my spine. My skin prickled with a deep, unnatural sense of dread. "Don't run," it whispered. "I'm already here." I froze, every muscle in my body refusing to obey. It was speaking to me, not just through the mirror, but through my own mind. It had invaded my thoughts, my every sense. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't outrun it. I turned toward the door again, desperation flooding my veins. But when I reached for the handle, it was no longer a door. It had changed. The surface had warped, the wood now twisted and gnarled, as though something had torn through it from the other side. The footsteps had stopped, but I could hear breathing now, slow, deep, and just behind me. It was like it was inside my head, inside my own skin. And then, a voice, no longer a whisper, came from the shadows, as cold and dark as the night outside. "You can't hide from me." The room went completely still. Everything around me froze, the air heavy and thick with dread. I turned around slowly, forcing my body to obey, and that's when I saw it. Standing in the corner of the room, near the shadows, was the figure, the one from the mirror. It wasn't a reflection anymore. It was real. Flesh and blood. It was me. I wanted to scream, but my voice wouldn't come. I couldn't make a sound. I couldn't even move. The figure stood still, staring at me with those dark, hollow eyes. Its smile twisted, growing wider, more mocking. "You'll never be free of me," it said, and its voice was my own, distorted and wrong. I staggered backward, my mind spinning as everything around me seemed to distort, the room closing in. The mask, lying there on the floor, called to me. It was a force I couldn't resist. It wasn't a mask anymore. It was a trap. My thoughts twisted, my breath shallow, as I felt a compulsion to put it back on. It was calling me, pulling me toward it, a dark force I couldn't escape. I fought it, tried to back away, but the pull was too strong. The figure in front of me stepped closer, and I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't a reflection anymore. It was here. "You or me," it whispered, the words slithering into my mind. And in that moment, I realized I had never left the party. I had never really escaped. The mask was the key. The mask was the door. And I had just unlocked it. I felt trapped, caught in the web of my own reflection, my own nightmares. The mask on the floor beckoned to me, a force I couldn't resist, and yet I was terrified to touch it again. I could feel the weight of it, like it was something that held power over me, pulling at the strings of my very soul. The figure, my doppelganger, was still standing in the corner of the room, watching me with those unblinking eyes. Its mouth never stopped moving, smiling that grotesque, twisted grin. My body was frozen, my mind screaming for me to do something, anything, but I couldn't find the strength. "Why are you here?" I managed to croak, my voice shaky and barely a whisper. "What do you want from me?" The figure's smile stretched wider, impossibly so. The silence in the room seemed to swallow everything around us, making the air feel thick and suffocating. Then, in a voice that wasn't quite mine, but still so familiar, it spoke. "You're me. And I'm you. You've been running from this moment, but you can't outrun yourself." The words sent a shiver down my spine. I could feel a cold sweat forming on my skin, my pulse quickening. My mind raced. Running from myself? What did that even mean? The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, its eyes fixed on me with an almost comforting intensity. It moved like a shadow, smooth, eerie, never quite touching the ground. It didn't need to walk. It didn't need to breathe. It simply existed, as if the world itself was bending around it. "You've always been afraid of losing yourself," it said softly, its voice curling around my thoughts. "Afraid of forgetting who you are. But now, you're already lost." I stepped backward, my feet unsteady, but the figure's eyes followed me with every movement, never blinking, never faltering. It was as though it was connected to me, reflecting my every thought, my every fear. I could no longer tell if it was truly standing before me or if it had always been here, inside me, waiting for this exact moment. The mask. My eyes flickered to it, as if it had become the only thing in the room that could offer any answers. But deep down, I knew. I knew that putting it on would bind me further to this twisted version of myself. I would never be free. The figure would always be there. I closed my eyes, trying to focus, to clear my thoughts, but they only became more jumbled, more twisted. The mask was calling to me, an irresistible pull. The figure's voice seemed to echo in my mind, whispering promises and threats in the same breath. "Put it on, and you'll understand," it said, its voice almost coaxing, like a lullaby. "We'll be one." Finally. I couldn't breathe. The weight of its words, of the moment itself, was crushing me. One? We'll be one? My thoughts whirled. What would happen if I gave in? If I put the mask back on? Would I become the monster standing before me, or would it consume me entirely? "You're already too late," it whispered. "You've already made your choice." I opened my eyes, my hands shaking as I slowly reached down toward the mask. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to stop, to fight, but there was a strange sense of inevitability about it. My fingers brushed the cold, smooth surface of the mask, and I could feel a shock run through me. A connection. A tether between us, the figure and I. The room spun. My heart hammered in my chest. I'm not you," I whispered to myself, trying to convince myself, trying to hold on to whatever was left of who I was. But the figure only smiled, its eyes still fixed on me with that same knowing gaze. "We're the same," it said, and it was so close now, standing just inches away from me. Its breath was like ice on my skin. It was always meant to be. The mask seemed to pulsate in my hands. It was both an extension of myself and something alien, something that had taken root in me long before I'd ever known. I hesitated. What if I wasn't the one in control? What if I had been wearing the mask all along, without even realizing it? What if, when I put it on, I would lose everything? A soft, distant noise broke through my thoughts, a door creaking, the faintest sound of footsteps from another room. It was a sound I didn't recognize, yet it felt like an omen. The figure in front of me stepped closer, closer still, until its face was so near I could feel its cold breath against my skin. I could smell the faint scent of something metallic, something ancient. It reached for my hand, and for the first time, I felt the weight of its presence fully. The air seemed to grow heavier, the space closing in, making it impossible to breathe. "Make your choice," it whispered. And in that moment, the mask no longer felt like something I was holding, it felt like something that was holding me. I closed my eyes one last time. And when I opened them again, everything had changed. I blinked, disoriented, as the room seemed to shift. The familiar walls, the faded wallpaper, the old chair by the window, all of it seemed so distant, as though I were seeing it through a fog. A thick, pressing fog that clouded my thoughts and made everything feel wrong. I was still holding the mask, but it didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like it belonged to someone else. Someone who knew me better than I knew myself. My body trembled as I glanced around. The figure was gone. The room was empty, save for the unsettling silence that had taken its place. For a moment, I thought I had imagined everything, thought it was all some twisted dream. But I knew better. The mask in my hands was solid, real, and its coldness cut through the numbing fog that surrounded me. I dropped it on the floor, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The weight of it, the knowledge that I had just come face to face with something I couldn't comprehend, made my chest tighten. I didn't understand what was happening or how I had ended up here. The mask, the figure, the words, they haunted me like an echo of something I couldn't escape. Suddenly, there was a noise behind me, soft, like footsteps on the creaky floorboards. I spun around, my heart racing. No one. Just the empty, still room staring back at me. I took a few shaky steps backward, my eyes flicking to the clock on the wall. It was midnight. But somehow, the time seemed irrelevant. The world around me felt suspended, like I was in a place that wasn't quite real, but I couldn't escape it. Then I heard it again, closer this time. A rustling sound, faint and almost imperceptible. It came from the hallway. I didn't want to move, didn't want to investigate. But my curiosity, my fear, drove me forward. I slowly made my way toward the door, my hand brushing against the cool, smooth wood. My mind screamed for me to stop, to lock myself in this room and never leave. But something was pulling me outside, something I had to face. With trembling hands, I opened the door. The hallway was empty. But the air felt heavier here, thick with something I couldn't quite grasp. I took a tentative step forward, my eyes darting to the shadows that seemed to stretch farther than they should. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing at the far end of the hallway. It wasn't the same as before. This one was different, its features blurred, like a reflection in water, shifting and changing every time I tried to focus. But the eyes, they were the same. Those cold, unblinking eyes that watched me like I was its prey. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. But I could feel its gaze upon me, pressing into me like it knew something about me that I didn't. I took a step back, the mask still in my hand, my fingers clutching it tighter as if it were the only thing anchoring me to reality. The figure tilted its head, a slow, deliberate motion. Then, finally, it spoke. "You know me," it said, its voice a chilling whisper that scraped across my skin. "You know exactly who I am." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I didn't understand. How could I know? How could I know you? And then it clicked. The mask. The figure. The smile. I was looking at myself. But not just any version of myself. This was the true me. The one I had been running from. The one I had locked away. The realization hit me like a wave crashing against the shore. I had never been alone. Not truly. The mask was never just a costume, it was a part of me. The figure wasn't some stranger or doppelganger, it was me, stripped of all the layers I had built to protect myself. It was the me I had hidden away for years. The me I had ignored, rejected, and buried deep within. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat as the truth settled in. I had invited this version of myself into my life. I had chosen to ignore the darkness lurking inside, hoping it would fade on its own. But it never did. It only grew stronger. And now, it was coming for me. The figure took a step forward, its form becoming more solid, more defined. It was no longer a blur, but a mirror of everything I had ever feared about myself. "You can't escape me," it whispered, its voice dripping with a cold certainty. "You've never been able to." I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape this nightmare. But there was nowhere to go. The hallway stretched on forever, the shadows closing in on me, the figure moving closer, step by step. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The hallway was empty again. But I could still feel its presence, my presence, lingering in the air. The mask in my hand felt heavier than ever, its cold surface burning against my skin. I dropped it. The sound of the mask hitting the floor echoed through the empty hallway. But I knew it wasn't over. It would never be over. This has been a long, dark journey through the night with Whisper Crowley. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Leave a like if these stories made you look at the darkness a little differently, and share in the comments what you enjoyed most or what gave you chills. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next Sinister Whispers. Until we meet again in the world of shadows.